So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, somewhere above you, probably several miles up, there is a machine that is doing something that should be impossible. Inside that machine, air is being squeezed to 30 or 40 times the pressure of the atmosphere you are breathing. Fuel is being sprayed into that compressed air and ignited, and the temperature inside the combustion chamber has climbed past 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt steel. It is hot enough to melt the very metals that the engine is made from. And yet the engine does not melt. It does not buckle. It does not fail. It keeps running, smooth and steady, hour after hour, carrying 300 people across an ocean at 500 miles per hour, 5 miles above the sea. The turbine blades inside that engine, the ones that are sitting in that inferno right now, are spinning at something like 10,000 revolutions per minute.
Each blade is experiencing a centrifugal force equivalent to roughly 10 tons trying to rip it out of the disc. And the temperature of the gas rushing past those blades is actually higher than the melting point of the alloy they are made from. They survive because of a film of cooling air, thinner than a sheet of paper, flowing through microscopic channels inside the blade itself, keeping the metal just barely below the temperature at which it would lose its strength and let go. That film of air is the only thing between a routine flight and a catastrophic failure. And here is what I find so astonishing about that. We figured out how to do this, starting from almost nothing. Starting from a world where the most powerful flying machines were biplanes with wooden propellers, held together with wire, powered by engines that were basically car motors bolted to the front. In less than one human lifetime, we went from that to engines that operate in conditions more extreme than anything else we build, more extreme than a nuclear reactor, more extreme than a Formula One engine, more extreme than almost any machine on Earth. And the story of how we got there, the story of the jet engine, is really a story about walls. Walls that seemed impossible to get past. Walls that the smartest engineers of each generation looked at and said, "No, that cannot be done. The physics will not allow it. The materials do not exist. The money is not there. The idea is too strange." And then someone got past the wall anyway. And on the other side, they found the next wall, and the next. And the story keeps going, wall after wall, each one higher than the last, each one requiring a different kind of breakthrough to get through. And here is why this matters to you, right now, lying there in the dark. You have almost certainly been inside a jet engine's care.
If you have ever flown on a commercial airplane, you have handed your life to a machine that operates at temperatures that should destroy it, at speeds that should tear it apart, for hours at a stretch. And you probably did not think about it for 1 second. You put on your seatbelt, you watched a movie, you fell asleep, and the whole time, those turbine blades were spinning in that inferno, and that film of air was holding, and the engineering was working. How did we get to a place where something that extraordinary feels routine? How did a machine that was considered physically impossible in 1930 become so reliable by 1970 that you would trust it with your family without a second thought? What kind of people does it take to break through a wall that the entire scientific establishment says cannot be broken? And what does it cost them? Because that is part of this story too. The walls were not broken by institutions or committees. They were broken by individual human beings who were stubborn enough or desperate enough, or obsessed enough to keep pushing when everyone around them said to stop. And some of them paid for it with their careers, their health, their peace of mind. The man who invented the jet engine spent the last decades of his life in a country that was not his own, because his own country could not figure out what to do with him after it was done using his ideas. So, let's talk about that story. Let's walk through it together, from the very beginning, from the first time somebody strapped an engine to a flying machine and discovered that the hardest part was not getting into the air. The hardest part was figuring out what kind of engine could take you where you actually wanted to go. And if you drift off somewhere along the way, that is perfectly fine. The engines will still be running in the morning, the walls will still be there, and so will the people who figured out how to break through them.
Before we talk about jet engines, we need to talk about why they exist at all. Because the jet engine was not invented in a vacuum. It was invented because the engine that came before it, the piston engine, ran into a wall. And to understand that wall, you need to understand what it was like to fly with a piston engine and a propeller. And why that combination, as good as it was, could only take you so far. So let us go back, way back, to a time before anyone had flown at all, when the very idea of a powered flying machine was still something that most serious people considered either a fantasy or a stunt. The problem of flight had been gnawing at inventors and dreamers for centuries. But by the middle of the 1800s, people were starting to get serious about it. And the first thing they realized was that if you wanted to fly, you needed an engine. And the only engines anybody had in the 1850s were steam engines. Now, steam engines were extraordinary machines.
They had transformed the world. They powered factories, locomotives, and ships. But they had a problem. And for aviation, it was a fatal one. They were heavy. Brutally, absurdly heavy. Think about what a steam engine needs. You need a boiler, a big metal tank to hold the water. You need a firebox to burn the fuel. You need the fuel itself, usually coal. You need the water. And then you need the engine mechanism, the pistons and the cylinders and the rods and the flywheel. Add all of that up, and you get a machine that weighs a lot and produces relatively little power. The first person to actually fly with a steam engine was a French engineer named Henri Giffard, and his story tells you everything about the wall that early aviators were facing. In 1852, Giffard built a small steam engine and attached it to an airship, a big, hydrogen-filled balloon about 144 feet long.
His engine weighed about 100 pounds by itself, which does not sound too bad until you add the boiler, the firebox, the water, and the fuel. The total weight of the power plant came to roughly 550 pounds, and for all that weight, it produced exactly 3 horsepower. 3. To put that in perspective, the engine in a modern riding lawnmower produces more power than that. Giffard's airship managed to fly about 17 miles, but it was so underpowered that it could barely make headway against a gentle breeze. A mildly distressed pigeon could have pushed it off course. The core issue was something called the power-to-weight ratio. How much power does your engine produce per pound of its own weight? For Giffard's steam engine, that ratio was dismal, about 0.005 horsepower per pound. To put that in context, a decent engine for a heavier-than-air flying machine would need a ratio at least 50 to 100 times better than that.
Steam engines were simply too heavy for the amount of power they produced. And this was the first wall. Now, people did keep trying with steam. Over the next few decades, engineers built increasingly clever and lightweight steam engines for various flying machines. A Frenchman named Clément Ader built a pair of compound steam engines in the 1890s that were genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. Together they produced about 40 horsepower from a total installation, engines, boiler, firebox and condenser that weighed roughly 260 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio worked out to about 0.15 horsepower per pound, which was roughly 30 times better than Gifford's. But his flying machines, the Éole and the Avion 3, were aerodynamic disasters. The Éole managed a brief, uncontrolled hop of maybe 130 feet at a height of about 20 inches. The Avion 3 reportedly never left the ground at all.
Around the same time, Sir Hiram Maxim, the man who invented the machine gun, built an enormous biplane test rig in Kent, powered by 2 compound steam engines that together produced 360 horsepower. The thing was so large that it ran on its own 1,800-foot railway track. During a test in 1894, it actually generated enough lift to rise off the track and break free of its restraining rails before crashing. Maxim survived, but he gave up on flying. The steam engines themselves were magnificent. The flying machine was hopeless. This was a pattern. The engines were getting better, but they still were not good enough, and the machines they were attached to did not understand aerodynamics well enough to use even the limited power they had. What really broke through the wall of weight was not a better steam engine. It was an entirely different kind of engine, the internal combustion engine. And the difference it made was transformational.
In a steam engine, the fuel burns outside the engine. You burn coal or oil under a boiler to heat water into steam, and the steam pushes the pistons. All that boiler and water and firebox is dead weight that produces no power on its own. In an internal combustion engine, the fuel burns inside the cylinder itself. The expanding gases from combustion push the piston directly. No boiler, no water, no firebox. You just need the engine, a fuel tank, and some plumbing. The weight savings were enormous. The internal combustion engine had been around since the 1860s, but it took a few decades before it was refined enough to be useful for aviation. The key breakthrough came from a German engineer named Nikolaus Otto, who in 1876 built the first successful 4-stroke engine. This is the engine cycle that would power virtually every aeroplane for the next 70 years. And it is worth understanding because it is beautifully simple.
The piston slides down the cylinder, drawing in a mixture of fuel and air. Then it slides back up, compressing that mixture. A spark ignites the compressed mixture, and the expanding gases shove the piston back down with real force. That is your power stroke. Then the piston comes back up one more time to push the exhaust gases out. 4 strokes. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow. And then you do it again. The Otto engine ran on coal gas at first, but later versions switched to liquid fuels. Gasoline, which in those early days was considered a useless and somewhat dangerous byproduct of kerosene production, turned out to be perfect. It vaporized easily, burned cleanly, and packed a lot of energy into a small volume. Engines running on gasoline could spin faster, produce more power, and weigh less than anything that had come before. But even the early internal combustion engines were not good enough for heavier-than-air flight.
They were designed for cars and boats, not airplanes. And their power-to-weight ratios, while much better than steam, were still marginal. Getting them light enough and powerful enough and reliable enough for an airplane was its own challenge. A French company called de Dion Bouton made a critical contribution in 1895 with a small, high-speed gasoline engine for powered tricycles. What made it special was its use of electrical ignition. Previous engines had used something called hot tube ignition, where a metal or ceramic tube protruding into the cylinder was kept red hot by an external flame, and the fuel-air mixture would ignite whenever it got hot enough. The problem was that you could not control exactly when ignition happened. It just happened whenever the temperature was right, which made the engine rough and inefficient. Electrical ignition, using a spark that could be precisely timed, changed everything. You knew exactly when the power stroke was coming.
You could optimize the timing. You could run the engine faster. The de Dion-Bouton engines reached 1,800 revolutions per minute, which was more than double what earlier engines could do. Higher revolutions per minute meant more power strokes per minute, which meant more power from the same size engine. And because the power delivery was smoother, you could get away with a smaller, lighter flywheel, which saved more weight. The de Dion-Bouton engines were tiny. The most powerful ones produced only about 8 horsepower. They were not going to get a human being into the air on their own. But they proved a principle, that a small, light, high-speed gasoline engine was viable. And that principle opened the door. The first engine specifically designed for a full-sized airplane was built by a man named Charles Manley, who worked for Professor Samuel Langley at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington.
Langley had money from the US government and a burning desire to be the first person to achieve powered, manned, heavier-than-air flight. He needed an engine, and the engines available commercially were not good enough. Manley took a 5-cylinder rotary engine that a Hungarian-born mechanic named Stephen Balzer had been struggling with and essentially rebuilt it from scratch. He converted it from an air-cooled rotary to a water-cooled static radial, redesigned the cylinders using spun steel shells only about 1/16 of an inch thick, and hand-built nearly every component to tolerances that contemporary manufacturers said were impossible. The result was a masterpiece. The Manley-Balzer engine produced 52 horsepower and weighed only about 135 pounds. Its power-to-weight ratio was 0.39 horsepower per pound, which was extraordinary for 1901. Nothing else would match it for over a decade. It also ran at full throttle for up to 10 hours without failing, which was equally remarkable. Unfortunately, it was installed in a flying machine that was an aerodynamic nightmare. Langley's aerodrome was launched twice from a catapult on a houseboat on the Potomac River. Both times, it crashed into the water immediately. The engine was brilliant. The aeroplane was not. 9 days after Langley's second failure, on December 17, 1903, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, did what Langley could not. Orville and Wilbur Wright flew a powered, controlled, heavier-than-air machine at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Their engine was modest by comparison to Manley's creation. It was a 4-cylinder inline engine laid on its side, producing about 12 horsepower after it warmed up, with a power-to-weight ratio of roughly 0.08 horsepower per pound, which was about a fifth of what the Manley-Balzer engine achieved. But it did not matter, because the Wright brothers had done something that nobody else in the world had done properly. They had spent years flying gliders, studying aerodynamics, building their own wind tunnel, testing hundreds of wing shapes, and figuring out how to control an airplane in 3 dimensions. They understood flight. Their airplane was so aerodynamically efficient that it did not need a powerful engine. It just needed an engine that worked. Their engine did not even have a carburetor. Gasoline dripped onto the hot water jackets around the cylinders, evaporated, and got sucked into the intake ports by the vacuum of the pistons. It was crude, but it was light and reliable. And for a machine that only needed to fly for about 12 seconds on its first attempt, Reliable was enough. So, by December of 1903, the wall of weight had been broken.
The internal combustion engine, burning gasoline, turning a propeller, could get a human being into the air and keep them there. And the next few years saw an explosion of activity. Inventors and engineers across Europe and America threw themselves into building better aeroplanes and better engines, and progress was rapid. By 1906, the Antoinette 8V became the first airplane engine to go into actual series production. It was a liquid-cooled V8, originally designed for racing boats and then adapted for airplanes, and it produced about 50 horsepower from a package that weighed around 210 pounds. It powered many of the pioneering flights in Europe, including Alberto Santos Dumont's famous flight in 1906, which was the first witnessed and officially certified heavier-than-air flight on the continent. The Antoinette had something else that was innovative: the first successful use of a manifold fuel injector in an airplane engine.
Instead of a carburetor, which used a venturi, a narrowed section of pipe, to suck fuel into the airstream, the Antoinette sprayed fuel directly into the intake. It was more complex and expensive, and at the time it offered no real performance advantage, so fuel injection did not catch on widely for decades. But the idea was out there, waiting. V-engines like the Antoinette had some real advantages. By putting two banks of cylinders at an angle on a single crankshaft, you got more power strokes per revolution, which made the power delivery smoother and let you do away with the heavy flywheel entirely. The propeller itself, mounted on the crankshaft, acted as its own flywheel, its mass providing the inertia to carry the crankshaft through the dead spots between power strokes. That saved weight. But early V-engines were also troublesome. They were usually liquid-cooled, which meant radiators, water pumps, hoses and plumbing. And plumbing plus vibration plus flying meant plumbing that leaked. Many early engine failures came down to a cracked hose or a loose fitting, dripping coolant until the engine overheated. The engine that truly dominated aviation in the years before the First World War was not a V-engine, or an inline, or even a conventional radial. It was something much stranger. It was the rotary engine. And it was French. And it was, in its own peculiar way, a small miracle of engineering. In a normal piston engine, the engine block is bolted to the airplane, and the crankshaft spins inside it, turning the propeller. In a rotary engine, everything is reversed. The crankshaft is bolted to the airplane and does not move. The entire engine, all the cylinders and the crankcase and everything, spins around the fixed crankshaft. The propeller is bolted to the spinning crankcase, so it spins with the engine. This sounds insane, and it kind of was, but it solved several problems at once. First, because the whole engine was spinning through the air, it cooled itself. You did not need a radiator, or water jackets, or any of that heavy plumbing. The spinning mass of the engine was its own cooling system. Second, because the entire engine was a spinning mass, it acted as its own flywheel. You did not need a separate heavy flywheel to smooth out the power delivery. The spinning engine kept itself spinning. That saved more weight. The first truly successful rotary was the Gnome 7-cylinder, designed by three brothers named Seguin and unveiled in Paris in 1908. It weighed about 165 pounds and produced 50 horsepower at 1,200 revolutions per minute. The Seguins built it from a high-grade nickel-steel alloy, machining the cooling fins from solid metal, and they got it so right on the first attempt that the original engine survived for years and can still be found today at the Smithsonian.
The Gnome Rotary became a sensation after the 1909 Reims Air Race, where a pilot named Henri Farman swapped out his unreliable Belgian engine at the last minute for a Gnome and won several major prizes. After that, the Gnome took the world by storm. 35 engines sold in 1909.
400 in 1910, 800 in 1911, 1,000 in 1912, 1,400 in 1913. By that year, production of the Gnome rotary exceeded the combined total of every other aero engine manufactured in the world up to that point. But rotary engines had their own problems. Because the whole engine was a spinning mass, it created enormous gyroscopic forces. Try turning a spinning bicycle wheel while you are holding it. It resists you. It wants to stay in the plane it is spinning in. Now imagine that the spinning thing weighs 165 pounds and is bolted to the nose of your airplane.
When you tried to turn the airplane, the gyroscopic forces would fight you. Turning one direction was easy, turning the other direction was almost impossible. Rotary-powered airplanes had a distinctive flying characteristic. They could turn beautifully in one direction and barely at all in the other. Also, the spinning engine sucked in a lot of air, and not all of it went through the cylinders. It blew oil and exhaust in every direction, including back at the pilot, who sat in an open cockpit directly behind it. Pilots of rotary-powered airplanes wore goggles not just for the wind, but because they were being sprayed with castor oil, which was the standard lubricant for rotary engines because it would not dissolve in gasoline. Pilots frequently suffered from nausea and diarrhea because they could not avoid swallowing small amounts of the castor oil mist. Flying in the early days of aviation was glamorous in theory and deeply unglamorous in practice. And there was another problem, a subtler one. You could not really throttle a rotary engine. The fuel-air mixture entered the cylinders through automatic intake valves that opened by suction, and the amount of fuel was mostly fixed. You controlled the engine speed by cutting the ignition on and off, which is why early rotary-powered airplanes often sounded like they were hiccuping through the sky, engine barking on and off as the pilot tried to manage speed. This made precise landings and formation flying extremely difficult. Still, by 1914, when the First World War began, the basic templates for airplane engines had been established. You had your inline engines, your V-types, your radials, and your rotaries. The war would accelerate their development enormously, and by 1918, the engines of the later war years would make the Gnome 7 look like a toy. Wartime demanded more speed, more altitude, more power. Engine designers obliged. And this is where the next wall begins to come into focus. Because as engines got more powerful and aeroplanes got faster, engineers started to notice something troubling. There seemed to be a speed limit. Not a hard wall, not a sudden barrier, but a gradual thickening of the air's resistance, a creeping inefficiency that got worse the faster you tried to go. And the problem was not the engine. The problem was the propeller. A propeller is basically a rotating wing. Each blade is an airfoil shaped to generate lift, except instead of lifting the airplane upward, it pulls it forward. The propeller grabs a big mass of air and accelerates it backward, and by Newton's third law, the airplane gets pushed forward. And propellers are remarkably efficient at this job, at least at moderate speeds. At 300 miles per hour and below, a good propeller converts around 80% of the engine's shaft power into forward thrust. That is impressive. But there is a catch.
The tips of the propeller blades are moving much faster than the airplane itself, because they are simultaneously moving forward with the airplane and spinning in a circle. As the airplane goes faster, the tips of the blades approach the speed of sound. And when that happens, everything goes wrong. Shock waves form on the blade tips. Drag skyrockets. The propeller starts fighting itself, churning the air into turbulence instead of pushing it smoothly backward. Efficiency drops off a cliff. This was the wall of speed. And for the engineers of the 1920s and early 1930s, it looked like an absolute limit. You could build the most powerful piston engine imaginable,
But if you could not get the propeller to work efficiently above 350 or 400 miles per hour, all that extra power was wasted. The airplane just could not go faster. And here is where the story takes a turn that changes everything.
Because two young men, in two different countries, working independently, both looked at that wall and saw something that almost nobody else could see. They saw that the problem was not just the propeller. The problem was the entire concept of using a piston engine and a propeller to fly. The whole system had a built-in ceiling, and no amount of clever engineering within that system was going to raise it enough. What they needed was not a better propeller. What they needed was a completely different kind of engine. One of those young men was a Royal Air Force officer, the son of a factory foreman from Coventry, who had barely passed the physical requirements to join the service. He was small, stubborn, brilliant at mathematics, and he had been obsessed with flying since he was 4 years old, when his favorite toy was a tin model of a Blériot monoplane. His name was Frank Whittle, and the idea that he was about to have, sitting in a classroom at the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell in the flat, bleak Lincolnshire countryside, would be the most important single insight in the history of aviation. Whittle arrived at Cranwell as a cadet in 1926, just 23 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. He was 19 years old, and he had already had a bumpy journey getting there. The Royal Air Force initially rejected him because he was too short. He was devastated, but before he left the camp, a sympathetic physical training sergeant took pity on him, gave him a diet plan and a set of exercises, heavy on the deep breathing. 6 months later, Whittle had grown 3 inches taller and 3 inches wider around the chest. He applied again, but the ministry said no. Once you have been turned down, you are turned down forever. So Whittle did something that tells you a lot about his character.
He went through the entire application process a second time, from scratch, using his real name, but hoping the bureaucracy would not connect him to his earlier rejection. It worked. The paperwork slipped through, and he was in. At Cranwell, Whittle thrived. He was lazy with homework, by his own admission, but he came top of the class in mathematics and devoured books on subjects far beyond the curriculum. He learned to fly on the Avro 504K, an ancient biplane that had been old-fashioned even during the First World War, and he wrecked at least 3 airplanes through overconfidence, though he always walked away. He was an exceptional pilot and a natural engineer, and the Royal Air Force recognized both qualities, though not always at the same speed. It was during his time at Cranwell that Whittle was asked to write a thesis on future developments in aircraft design.
He chose to focus on the engine side of things, and he attacked the problem with the mathematical tools he had been quietly teaching himself for years. What he worked out was essentially this. If you wanted to fly very fast and very far, you had to fly very high. At 50,000 feet, the air is thin and cold, and there is much less drag. An airplane at that altitude can cover enormous distances efficiently. But here was the problem. A piston engine needs air to burn fuel, and as you climb higher, the air gets thinner. Even with a supercharger, a device that forces extra air into the engine, there comes an altitude where the piston engine simply cannot breathe. It cannot get enough air to burn enough fuel to generate enough power to overcome its own internal friction. The engine chokes, and at those speeds, 500 miles per hour and above, the propeller was hopeless anyway. The blade tips would be deep into the supersonic range, churning uselessly.
So Whittle started looking for a different kind of power plant, something that could work at extreme altitude, something that did not need a propeller. And the chain of reasoning he followed was both simple and profound. He started by imagining a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage. The fan would blow air out the back, and the airplane would be pushed forward by the reaction. Newton's third law, same as a rocket, same as a balloon shooting across the room when you let the air out. But then he thought, why not get rid of the piston engine entirely? Why not raise the compression ratio of the fan, add a combustion chamber behind it, burn fuel in the compressed air, and use the hot expanding gases to drive a turbine that would spin the fan? No pistons, no crankshaft, no propeller, just a compressor, a combustion chamber, and a turbine, all connected on a single shaft. Air comes in the front, gets squeezed, gets heated, rushes out the back, and on its way out spins a turbine that keeps the compressor turning. That was the concept, and once he had it, Whittle later recalled, he could not believe he had not thought of it sooner. It seemed so obvious. The turbojet engine was, at its core, a devastatingly simple idea. One main moving part: continuous combustion instead of thousands of individual explosions per minute. No reciprocating masses slamming back and forth, just smooth rotation. And because the thrust came from the exhaust itself, there was no propeller to worry about, no blade tips hitting the speed of sound. The exhaust could go as fast as you could push it. Whittle prepared this thesis in the first half of 1928. His professor did not entirely understand it, but gave him 30 out of 30, which Whittle considered quite satisfactory. He was 21 years old, and he had just described the future of powered flight with remarkable accuracy. He predicted airplane speeds of 500 miles per hour at a time when the fastest propeller-driven planes struggled to reach 150. A friend and colleague at the Central Flying School, a man named W.E.P. Johnson, who happened to be trained as a patent agent, became interested in the idea and helped Whittle draft a patent application. The patent was filed in January of 1930, when Whittle was 22. It described the essential architecture of a turbojet engine in clear, precise terms. Armed with his patent, Whittle went to see the people he thought would be most interested. He approached British industry. He went to London to present his idea to the Air Ministry. He met with Dr. A. Griffith, one of the ministry's top scientists, at South Kensington. The reception was, as Whittle put it, very cool. Griffith pointed out an error in Whittle's calculations, which was valid but did not undermine the core concept. Industry was no more enthusiastic. The prevailing theory at the time said that gas turbines were fundamentally impractical because the compressors and turbines of the era were too inefficient. By the time you powered the compressor and accounted for all the losses, there would be nothing left over for useful thrust. The mathematics seemed to prove it. Whittle disagreed. He believed, and time would prove him right, that compressor and turbine efficiencies would improve with development. He was thinking about the future, not the present. But nobody shared his optimism, and his patent application became public knowledge. The Air Ministry decided it was not worth keeping secret. This would have consequences later. Meanwhile, the response was depressing enough that Whittle essentially shelved the idea for several years. He served as a flying instructor, got married, performed dazzling aerobatics of the Hendon air pageants, and quietly nursed his frustration that nobody could see what he could see. The patent fees came due in 1930, and Whittle could not afford to renew the full protection. Parts of his patent lapsed. The invention that would reshape the world was, for a time, abandoned. And while Whittle's idea gathered dust in England, a young German physics student was having a very similar thought, triggered by a very different experience. Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain was born in 1911 in Dessau, Germany. Unlike Whittle, who came from a working-class family and had to fight for every opportunity, von Ohain came from minor aristocracy. He studied physics at the University of Göttingen, one of the great scientific institutions in the world at the time. And his interest in a new kind of engine started not with a mathematical analysis of speed and altitude like Whittle's, but with something more aesthetic. The first time von Ohain flew in a commercial airplane, a 3-engine Junkers, he was deeply disappointed. It was so noisy, he later said, so vibratory that he felt the piston engine and propeller was simply not the right propulsion system for flight. The elegance of flying was destroyed by it. Von Ohain wanted smoothness. He wanted silence. He wanted an engine worthy of the beauty of flight. And from that starting point, thinking about smoothness and low noise rather than speed and altitude, he arrived at essentially the same solution as Whittle: a turbine engine that produced thrust by expelling hot gases, with no pistons hammering back and forth and no propeller tearing at the air. Von Ohain conceived his jet engine idea around 1933, several years after Whittle, and apparently without knowledge of Whittle's patent, though the patent was publicly available. This is one of those cases in the history of engineering where the same idea occurs to multiple brilliant people independently, because the underlying physics is sitting there, waiting to be discovered. The problem was obvious to anyone who looked hard enough at the limits of piston engines and propellers. The solution was implicit in the thermodynamics. Two men on opposite sides of the North Sea, from completely different backgrounds, with completely different motivations, arrived at the same place. But what happened next in their two stories could not have been more different. And that difference, the contrast between how Britain treated Whittle's idea and how Germany treated von Ohain's, is one of the most frustrating and consequential chapters in the history of aviation. Because while Whittle was getting rejections and polite brush-offs from every direction, von Ohain walked into the office of Ernst Heinkel, one of the most powerful aircraft manufacturers in Germany, and found something that Whittle could only dream of. He found a man who said yes. Heinkel was a legend in Germany's resurgent aviation industry. He was ambitious, competitive, and obsessed with speed. When von Ohain explained his idea for a jet engine, Heinkel did not hesitate. He invited von Ohain to his villa, told him that he wanted to finance the entire development himself, and offered him the resources of one of the best-equipped aircraft companies in Europe. Money, Heinkel said, would not be a problem. And it was not. Von Ohain moved to Heinkel's facilities on the Baltic coast, assembled a team, and began building. He had first-rate machine tools, skilled technicians, and the backing of a man who wanted results and was willing to pay for them. By contrast, Whittle was working out of a converted foundry with a handful of people, struggling to keep the lights on. This brings us to the next wall. Because Whittle's idea was sound, and von Ohain's idea was sound, and the physics was on their side. But knowing that a jet engine should work, and actually making one work, are two very different things. And the wall they both now faced was not a wall of physics or mathematics, it was a wall of belief. Almost nobody in the engineering establishment thought a turbojet engine could be made practical, and convincing the world otherwise was going to require something more than a good idea on paper. It was going to require an engine that actually ran. And getting to that point, as both men were about to discover,
would be far harder and far more dangerous than either of them expected. By 1936, Whittle's fortunes had changed, slightly. A letter arrived from an old friend at Cranwell named Ralph Dudley Williams, who had met a businessman with connections to finance. Williams and another former RAF officer named Tinling approached Whittle with a proposal. They would form a company and try to raise money to build his engine. Whittle told them honestly that he thought the project had a 1 in 3 chance of success. They went ahead anyway. A merchant bank called Falcon Partners was persuaded to commission an independent technical assessment of Whittle's concept, written by an aeronautical engineer named Bramson. Bramson's report was wholly favourable, and on the strength of it, Falcon Partners agreed to back the project. In March of 1936, they formed a company called Powerjets Limited. The total funding was painfully small, £22,000, well below what the project really needed. The Air Ministry imposed an additional constraint. Whittle, who was still a serving officer, was not permitted to work more than 6 hours a week on the project. Whittle later admitted that this rule was entirely ineffective as a constraint on him. He approached the British Thomson Houston Company in Rugby, which manufactured steam turbines and had the tooling to produce the precision components he needed. He drove over from Cambridge, where he was simultaneously studying for his engineering degree, and somehow convinced this huge company to accept a contract worth less than what the job actually required. The proper scientific approach, Whittle knew, would have been to build and test each component separately, the compressor, the turbine, the combustion chambers, before combining them. But that would have cost £30,000, and he did not have £30,000. So he went straight to building a complete engine and hoped for the best.
The engine was assembled in a cavernous workshop at BTH's Rugby factory. Whittle stood over the process, watching every step. He was confident about the compressor, which was a simple centrifugal design, the kind used in superchargers, spinning at high speed to sling air outward and compress it. He was fairly confident about the turbine, but the combustion chamber worried him deeply. They were attempting to burn fuel at an intensity roughly 24 times anything that had been achieved before. Nobody knew if it would work. On April 12, 1937, the engine was ready for its first run. A lot of people had said it would not even turn itself over against its own friction. What happened proved the opposite, though not in the way anyone intended. Whittle gave the signal to bring the speed up to 2,000 revolutions per minute using the electric starting motors. Then he opened the main fuel control. The engine caught, it started to run, and then it accelerated.
And kept accelerating, wildly, uncontrollably. The speed climbed far past anything it was supposed to reach. People who had been standing around watching scattered down the length of the factory at a dead run. Whittle himself was frozen in place, too terrified to move. He later said he was literally petrified with fright. The problem was that a pool of unburned fuel had accumulated in the combustion chamber during the startup sequence, and when it finally ignited, there was far more energy available than the control system could handle. The engine was running on its stored fuel, even after Whittle shut off the main control. It looked like perpetual motion, though of course it was not. This kind of terrifying runaway happened 4 more times in the following days before they got it under control. Each time, the engine screamed up to dangerous speeds and everyone fled the building. But when it was not trying to destroy itself, the engine ran. It actually ran. It was self-sustaining. It proved that the concept worked. Whittle submitted a report to the Air Ministry. The report was reviewed by Griffith, the same Dr. Griffith
who had dismissed Whittle's idea years earlier. Griffith's assessment damned the engine with faint praise. He emphasized every difficulty, noted that the absence of a propeller meant no slipstream to help with takeoff, and gave the strong impression that the whole thing was marginally interesting at best. Whittle did not know it, but in Germany, things were moving much faster. Von Ohain, backed by Heinkel's resources, had built a working engine too, and Heinkel, who was not a man to wait for bureaucratic approval, was already building an airplane to put it in. On August 27, 1939, just 5 days before Germany invaded Poland and started the Second World War, a test pilot named Erich Warsitz climbed into a small single-engine airplane at Heinkel's airfield on the Baltic coast. The airplane was the Heinkel HE-178, and it was powered by von Ohain's turbojet engine. Warsitz started the engine, taxied to the end of the runway, opened the throttle, and took off. He disappeared from view. For a long, tense moment, the engineers on the ground waited, wondering if something had gone wrong. Then they saw him coming back. He flew over the field, and they thought he was going to land. But he did not land. He went around again. He was enjoying it. The flight was smooth, the engine was running well, and Warsitz was having the time of his life. They had not loaded much fuel, though, so eventually he came in and touched down. He stopped the airplane right where Heinkel was standing and told him that everything had functioned beautifully. There was a celebration. Heinkel, thrilled, called General Ernst Udet at the German Air Ministry.
Udet's response, according to several accounts, was something along the lines of, "Congratulations, but let me sleep. It is an ungodly hour." The German military establishment, like its British counterpart, was not immediately impressed by jet propulsion. That would change, but it would take time and the pressure of war to make it change. Meanwhile, Whittle was still fighting for survival in England. His financial backers were getting cold feet. They had expected, somewhat unrealistically, that within a month or two, Whittle would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere. Instead, they got breakdown after breakdown, explosion after explosion, and a bottomless demand for more money. Whittle's team had grown to about half a dozen people, working in a converted foundry called Ladywood Works that was cramped, noisy, and inadequate. A critical breakthrough came on June 30th, 1939, when the Director of Scientific Research from the Air Ministry visited Ladywood to see the engine run. Whittle's team managed to keep the engine going for about 20 minutes. The director was converted on the spot. He agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an airplane to use it should be ordered too. When Whittle drove him to the train station afterward, the director spent the entire ride explaining to Whittle all the advantages of the jet engine. It was vibrationless. It could run on any fuel. It was mechanically simple. Whittle sat quietly and listened. He was a squadron leader at the time, and the director was a very senior official, so he kept his thoughts to himself. But inside he was thinking, "Yeah, you are telling me." This was the turning point. The turbojet was saved for Britain, but Germany, unaware that Whittle had just gotten his break, was already years ahead.
The He-178 had already flown, and as the war began, both countries would discover that building a jet engine that ran on a test stand and building one that could survive inside an aeroplane in combat were two entirely different problems. Because now they faced the wall that would prove to be the most punishing, the most persistent, and the most technically demanding of all the walls in this story. The wall of temperature. And breaking through it would require not just new ideas, but new materials, new manufacturing techniques, and a willingness to push metal to the very edge of what it could endure. To understand the wall of temperature, you first need to understand what is actually happening inside a jet engine when it runs. And it is worth taking a moment to walk through this carefully, because the logic of it is genuinely beautiful once you see it, and everything that comes after depends on understanding it. Think of a jet engine as a tube.
Not a complicated tube, just a long metal tube. Air enters one end, air exits the other. In between, three things happen to that air, and they always happen in the same order. First, the air gets compressed. A spinning compressor at the front of the engine grabs the incoming air and squeezes it to many times its original pressure. Imagine taking a room full of air and cramming it into a closet. The air gets denser, hotter just from the compression, and it is now under tremendous pressure. In a modern engine, the compressor might boost the incoming air pressure by 20 or 30 or even 40 times. At sea level, where the ambient air pressure is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, that means the air coming out of the compressor is at 300, 400, maybe 600 pounds per square inch. Second, the compressed air flows into a combustion chamber, where fuel is sprayed into it and ignited.
The fuel burns continuously, not in separate explosions like a piston engine, but in a steady, sustained flame. The burning fuel heats the air enormously. Temperatures in the combustion chamber can exceed 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The air, now a mass of superheated gas, wants desperately to expand. Third, the hot gas rushes out the back of the engine, through a turbine, and then through an exhaust nozzle. As it passes through the turbine, the gas spins the turbine blades, and because the turbine is connected by a shaft to the compressor at the front, this is what keeps the compressor spinning. The turbine extracts a lot of energy from the gas, roughly 3/4 of it, just to power the compressor. Whatever energy is left after that drives the gas out through the exhaust nozzle at high velocity, and that is your thrust. That is the push that moves the aeroplane forward.
This cycle, compression, combustion, expansion, is the same basic cycle that a piston engine uses: suck, squeeze, bang, blow. But in a jet engine, it happens continuously, in a steady flow, rather than in individual pulses. And because there are no pistons slamming back and forth, no crankshaft converting linear motion to rotary motion, no valves opening and closing thousands of times per minute, the whole thing is much simpler mechanically. One main moving part: the compressor, shaft, and turbine all bolted together, spinning as a single unit. Now, here is a useful concept that we can carry with us through the rest of this story. The amount of thrust a jet engine produces can be expressed in a very simple equation. Thrust equals mass times acceleration. T equals m times a. The mass is the amount of air flowing through the engine, the air and a little bit of fuel. The acceleration is how much faster that air is moving when it leaves the engine compared to when it came in. These are the only two things that matter. If you want more thrust, you either push more air through the engine, make m bigger, or you speed the air up more as it passes through, make a bigger. Every design decision in the history of jet engines comes down to some version of this trade-off. But back to the wall of temperature. The combustion chamber is running at 3,500 degrees. The gas leaving the combustion chamber and hitting the turbine is somewhere above 2,000 degrees. And here is the problem. The turbine blades are made of metal, and metal, at those temperatures, does not behave the way you want it to. At room temperature, metals are strong. They hold their shape. They resist forces.
But as you heat a metal up, it weakens. The atoms start vibrating more, the crystal structure loosens, and the metal begins to creep, which is an engineering term for slowly deforming under stress, even stress well below what would break it at room temperature.
Heat a metal enough, and it loses so much strength that it cannot support its own weight, let alone the enormous centrifugal forces of spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute. Heat it more, and it melts. When Whittle was developing his first engine in the late 1930s, the best available alloys could handle maybe 900 to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit reliably. That put a hard ceiling on how hot you could run the engine, which put a hard ceiling on how much thrust it could produce, which put a hard ceiling on how fast and how high the airplane could fly. The temperature of the gas entering the turbine is the single most important number in jet engine design. It is called the turbine inlet temperature, and everything, the engine's power, its efficiency, its fuel consumption, its life, revolves around it. Higher turbine inlet temperature means more energy in the gas, which means more thrust and better efficiency.
But higher temperature means the turbine has to survive hotter conditions, which requires better materials and cleverer cooling, which adds weight and complexity. This tension between wanting to run hotter and the materials not being able to take it is the wall of temperature, and it has defined the entire trajectory of jet engine development from the very beginning to the present day. Now, to really understand why this wall of temperature matters so much and why it dominates the lives of jet engine engineers even today, we need to spend a little more time inside the engine itself. Because the turbojet, as simple as its core concept is, has a lot going on inside it that is worth understanding. And the more you understand about how the parts work together, the more you appreciate just how extraordinary it is that the thing works at all. Let us build a jet engine together, piece by piece, from the front to the back. We will keep it simple, but we will not skip anything important.
Start at the front. Air enters the engine through an inlet section. This is a relatively simple stationary structure whose job is to guide the incoming air smoothly into the compressor. It has a set of inlet guide vanes, airfoil-shaped pieces that are slightly twisted to turn the incoming air so that it hits the spinning compressor blades at the correct angle. Think of it like aiming a stream of water at a water wheel. You want to hit the paddles at the angle that transfers the most energy. The inlet vanes do the same thing for air. There is also a nose cone, a streamlined bullet shape in the center that keeps the air flowing smoothly around the hub of the compressor. Now, the compressor. This is where the real work begins. The compressor has two main components: the rotor, which spins, and the stator, which does not. The rotor is made up of several stages, and each stage consists of a disc with many small airfoil-shaped blades mounted around its outer edge. Think of each stage as something like a glorified electric fan, except with many more blades and spinning much faster. When the rotor spins, the blades grab the incoming air and push it backward, adding energy to it. Behind each spinning rotor stage is a stationary stator stage. The stator vanes receive the air from the rotor in front of them, straighten it out, redirect it at the proper angle for the next rotor stage, and slow it down a bit, so that some of the velocity energy is converted to pressure energy. This is important. You do not just want to make the air spin faster and faster, you want to compress it to increase its pressure. And the way you do that is by alternating spinning rotor stages that add energy with stationary stator stages that convert that energy into pressure. Each pair of rotor and stator adds a little more pressure. Stage by stage, the air gets squeezed into a progressively smaller space. You can see this in the physical shape of the compressor. The blades in the front stages are long because they are handling a large volume of low-pressure air. The blades in the rear stages are short because the air has been squeezed down to a much smaller volume. By the time the air leaves the last stage of the compressor, it might be at 20 or 30 times the pressure it was when it entered. The air leaving the compressor is not only at high pressure, but also quite hot, several hundred degrees Fahrenheit, just from the compression alone. This hot, high-pressure air now enters the diffuser section, which is a widening passage designed to slow the air down further before it reaches the combustion chamber. Why slow it down? Because the air coming out of the compressor is moving very fast, and you cannot burn fuel efficiently in a stream of air that is moving at several hundred feet per second. The flame would get blown out. So the diffuser slows the air to a manageable speed while retaining the high pressure. Then comes the combustion section. In early engines, and in many engines still, the combustion section uses a set of individual burner cans arranged in a circle inside the engine casing. Each can has fuel nozzles at the front that spray a fine mist of fuel into the incoming air. The fuel mixes with the air and is ignited, initially by igniter plugs that work much like the spark plugs in a car. But once combustion is established, the flame is continuous and self-sustaining. The igniters can be turned off. The flame just keeps burning as long as fuel is supplied. Now here is something clever about the combustion chamber that most people do not realize. Only about 1/4 of the air flowing through the engine actually participates in combustion. The other 3/4 is used for cooling. The flame inside the burner can reach 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit or more, which is hot enough to melt or severely damage the metal walls of the can. So the burner can is designed with a myriad of holes of different sizes and shapes, carefully arranged so that a blanket of cooler air flows along the inside of the can walls, insulating the metal from the flame. The flame is centered in the middle of the can by this surrounding air, and it never actually touches the metal walls. The burned gases and the cooling air mix together at the exit of the burner, which brings the temperature down substantially before the gas reaches the turbine. The burner cans are interconnected by small flame tubes, so that during starting, a flame that ignites in one can quickly spreads to all the others. Usually only 2 of the cans have igniter plugs. The rest catch fire from their neighbors. In newer engine designs, the individual burner cans have been replaced by a single annular combustion chamber, one continuous ring of flame that wraps all the way around the engine.
The annular design is smaller, lighter, and more efficient because there are no separate cans and no need for the complex outlet duct that transitions from multiple circular openings to a single annular one. But the basic principles are the same: fuel spray, ignition, continuous combustion, and careful management of cooling air to protect the metal. After the combustion chamber comes the turbine, and this is where the wall of temperature hits hardest. The turbine sits directly downstream of the burner, receiving the full blast of hot gas. Its job is to extract enough energy from that gas to drive the compressor at the front of the engine. Roughly 3/4 of the energy in the exhaust gas is absorbed by the turbine just for this purpose. What remains continues out through the exhaust nozzle as thrust. The turbine, like the compressor, has stages of rotating blades and stationary vanes. But the turbine works in reverse. Where the compressor adds energy to the air by speeding it up, the turbine extracts energy from the gas by slowing it down. The hot gas hits the curved turbine blades, pushes them, and makes the turbine spin. The turbine is connected by a shaft to the compressor, so they spin together at the same speed. Because the turbine is extracting energy from the gas rather than adding it, it can do its work in far fewer stages than the compressor. A compressor might have 9 or 12 or even 16 stages to build up the pressure. A turbine might need only 2 or 3 stages to extract the energy needed to drive all of those compressor stages.
The gas wants to expand. The turbine is letting it expand in a controlled way, harvesting the energy as it does. But the turbine has to survive conditions that make the compressor's job look easy. The compressor handles relatively cool air, a few hundred degrees at most. The turbine handles gas at 2,000 degrees or more.
The turbine blades are spinning just as fast as the compressor, which means they're experiencing the same enormous centrifugal forces, but at temperatures where the metal is significantly weakened. And they have to do this for thousands of hours. If anyone ever tells you that a turbojet engine has only one main moving part, they are technically correct. The compressor, the shaft, and the turbine are all bolted together and spin as one unit. One main rotating assembly, supported by bearings at the front and the rear, and sometimes in the middle. That simplicity, compared to the hundreds of reciprocating parts in a piston engine, is one of the turbojet's great strengths. After the turbine, the remaining gas flows into the exhaust duct, which narrows to form a nozzle at the very end. The narrowing passage speeds the gas up, the same way pinching the end of a garden hose speeds up the water.
This final acceleration gives the gas its highest velocity just as it leaves the engine, and that velocity is your thrust. The exhaust nozzle is carefully sized, its opening measured in square inches, to produce the exact gas velocity needed for the specified thrust. And that is the whole engine. Inlet, compressor, diffuser, burner, turbine, exhaust nozzle. Air comes in the front at the speed of the airplane, gets compressed, gets heated, spins the turbine, and shoots out the back at 1,000 miles per hour or more. The difference between the velocity of the air going in and the velocity of the gas going out, multiplied by the mass of air flowing through, gives you the thrust. T equals m times A. Now, one thing that became apparent very early in the history of jet engines is that if you want more power, you need a higher compression ratio. Higher compression means you can burn more fuel efficiently and extract more energy. But building a compressor with a very high compression ratio creates a problem. All the stages of the compressor are bolted to the same shaft and spin at the same speed. The big, long blades at the front are trying to grab a large volume of low-pressure air. The small, short blades at the rear are working under high pressure and trying to create even more pressure. The ideal speed for the front stages is different from the ideal speed for the rear stages, but they are all locked together. If you try to run them all at one speed, you get a compromise where neither the front nor the rear stages are operating at their best. And if the compromise gets bad enough, you run into a phenomenon called compressor stall. This is exactly what it sounds like. The airfoil-shaped blades, which are basically tiny wings, stall. Just as an airplane wing can stall if the angle of attack gets too steep, a compressor blade can stall if the airflow angle is wrong. When a blade stalls, it stops pumping air effectively. The smooth flow through the compressor breaks down. Air can actually reverse direction and flow forward, and the engine surges. You get vibration, loud bangs, irregular combustion, overheating, and sometimes flame out. The solution to this problem was the dual rotor engine, sometimes called a twin spool engine. Instead of one big compressor on one shaft, you have two separate compressors, each driven by its own turbine, each spinning on its own shaft at its own speed. The low-pressure compressor at the front, driven by a low-pressure turbine at the rear, handles the initial stages of compression. The high-pressure compressor behind it, driven by a high-pressure turbine, handles the final stages. The two shafts spin independently, one inside the other, so each compressor can run at whatever speed is most efficient for its job. This was a major innovation, and most modern jet engines use some version of it. Some use 3 spools instead of 2, with an intermediate pressure compressor and turbine in between. Rolls-Royce is particularly associated with the 3-spool design. Another critical invention for managing compressor health was the variable angle stator vane. Instead of having stator vanes fixed at one angle, some stages have vanes that can be mechanically tilted to adjust the angle at which air enters the next rotor stage. By changing these angles as the engine speed changes, the air always hits the blades at close to the optimal angle, dramatically reducing the risk of stall. In conjunction with compressor bleed valves, which can release excess air from the compressor during starting and at low power settings to prevent pressure buildup that could trigger a stall, variable stators made it possible to build compressors with much higher compression ratios than would otherwise be safe.
All of these features, the dual rotor design, the variable stators, the bleed valves, are controlled automatically by the engine's fuel control system. The pilot has a single throttle lever, and everything else happens by itself. The fuel control is a brain of sorts. It senses temperatures and pressures at critical points throughout the engine, monitors rotor speeds, and adjusts fuel flow, bleed valve positions, stator vane angles, and exhaust nozzle settings to keep the engine running smoothly and safely, regardless of what the pilot asks it to do or what the weather is doing outside. In early engines, this was done with intricate hydromechanical computers, elegant arrangements of levers, cams, and fluid circuits. In modern engines, it is done digitally by a system called FADEC, which stands for Full Authority Digital Engine Control. The computer manages the engine thousands of times per second, making adjustments that no human pilot could make fast enough. The pilot pushes the throttle forward. The computer does everything else. Fuel flow, stator angles, bleed valves, nozzle position, igniter timing, all of it. Coordinated and optimized in real time. The pilot is commanding the result. The computer is managing the process. It is, as one engineer put it, like having a genie at his command. All he has to do is ask. Now, all of that, the dual rotor compressor, the variable stators, the bleed valves, the digital fuel control, those are features that took decades to develop. They exist in modern engines because generations of engineers solved one problem at a time. But to understand why those problems needed solving in the first place, we need to go back to the 1940s, to the very first jet engines that tried to survive in combat, and to the wall of temperature that nearly stopped the whole project cold. The Germans were the first to confront this wall in earnest, because they were the first to try to build a jet engine that could actually fly in combat. And the story of how they dealt with it is a story of brilliant engineering, forced to cut corners by the pressures of war. After the HE-178's maiden flight in August of 1939, Heinkel immediately pushed for a twin-engine jet fighter. But the German Air Ministry, for political reasons as much as technical ones, chose not to go with Heinkel's design. Instead, they gave the fighter contract to Messerschmitt, and the engine contract went to a company called Junkers. The engine that Junkers developed was called the UMO 004, and it was a remarkably sophisticated piece of work. Unlike Whittle's engine, which used a centrifugal compressor, a disc that slung air outward to compress it, the UMO 004 used an axial flow compressor. In an axial compressor, air flows straight through, parallel to the axis of the engine, passing through a series of spinning rotor blades and stationary stator vanes. Each pair of rotor and stator forms one stage, and each stage adds a bit more compression. By stacking many stages in a row, you can achieve very high compression ratios in a long, narrow package. This was important for a fighter airplane because an axial engine could be made much slimmer and more streamlined than a centrifugal one. The UMO-004 had an 8-stage axial compressor, and it was aerodynamically efficient. But it had a problem that nearly killed the project. The turbine, sitting in the full blast of the combustion gases, could not survive for very long. The best German alloys of the time, even the nickel-based superalloys they were developing, could not handle the temperatures and stresses for more than a few dozen hours. In operational service, the UMO-004 had a service life of roughly 25 hours. After 25 hours, the engine was scrap. The turbine blades would be cracked, warped, and eroded. The entire engine had to be replaced. 25 hours. Think about that for a second. A modern jet engine on a commercial airliner can run for 10 or 15 or even 20,000 hours between overhauls. Some have gone longer. The UMO-004 lasted 25. That gap tells you the size of the wall that the early jet engine builders were up against. To make matters worse, the engine was extremely sensitive to throttle movements. If the pilot pushed the throttle forward too quickly, the fuel flow would increase faster than the airflow. The fuel-to-air ratio would go out of balance, and the flame in the combustion chamber could blow out entirely. The engine would just stop.
In the middle of a dogfight, at 200 miles per hour, 1,000 feet off the ground, the engine would quit. The pilot who survived a flameout had to try to relight the engine in mid-air while simultaneously not crashing into the ground. The same thing could happen if the pilot pulled the throttle back too quickly. Quick throttle movements in either direction could kill the engine. Despite these limitations, the Messerschmitt 262, the twin-engine jet fighter that used the UMO-004, was a formidable airplane when it worked. It was fast, much faster than anything the Allies had, capable of over 500 miles per hour. When it appeared in combat in the summer of 1944, Allied pilots were genuinely alarmed. Nothing they were flying could catch it. But the engines were so unreliable, and the airplane was rushed into service with so many unresolved issues, that the Me-262 never achieved the impact it could have had. On the British side, Whittle's journey to getting a jet aeroplane into combat was a story of maddening delays. His engine was sound, more reliable than the German designs, easier to handle, less temperamental. But the industrial and bureaucratic machine that was supposed to turn his invention into a weapon kept getting in his way. The aeroplane that was supposed to carry his engine into battle was the Gloucester Meteor, a twin-engine jet fighter. But the production of the Meteor's engines was contracted to a car manufacturer called Rover, who had no experience with jet engines and, in Whittle's blunt assessment, made an absolute nonsense of the job. Rover kept trying to redesign the engine without fully understanding it, and the delays mounted. What should have been ready by 1942 slipped to 1943 and beyond. Meanwhile, the Air Ministry, which had once ignored Whittle, now insisted that he share his designs with every major engine company in the country.
For the war effort, this was understandable. But for power jets, Whittle's tiny company, it was devastating. The big companies got all of Whittle's knowledge for free, while power jets was gradually squeezed out of the very industry it had created. In December of 1942, Rolls-Royce finally took over engine production from Rover, and things immediately improved. Rolls-Royce had the engineering depth, the manufacturing precision, and the institutional commitment to do the job properly. The Meteor finally flew in March of 1943 and entered operational service in July of 1944, more than 2 years later than it could have been available if the industrial politics had not gotten in the way. Whittle's engine, the W2B, was more reliable than the German Dumo. It used a centrifugal compressor, which was simpler and more tolerant of manufacturing imperfections than an axial design. Its turbine ran at lower temperatures, partly because the materials would not tolerate more, and partly because Whittle designed it with generous safety margins. It would not set any speed records, but it would keep running. And for a combat airplane, an engine that keeps running is worth more than a faster engine that quits. But even Whittle's engines were pushing up against the wall of temperature. The turbine blades were operating near the limit of what the available alloys could tolerate. Every degree hotter meant a shorter lifespan. Every attempt to get more power meant running closer to the edge. The first Meteor mission of the war was not against enemy aircraft, but against the V-1 flying bomb, the German cruise missile that was terrorizing London. The Meteor pilots of 616 Squadron at Manston in Kent discovered that their jets were fast enough to catch the V-1s. Some pilots shot them down with guns. Others used a remarkable technique. They flew alongside the V-1, tucked their wingtip under the missile's wing, and flipped it over, sending it spiraling into the ground before it could reach London. But the Meteor never faced the Me-262 in combat. The two jets never met in the air. By the time the Meteor was operational, the Luftwaffe was in retreat and could no longer mount raids over Britain. And the Me-262, though terrifying in concept, was crippled by its unreliable engines and Germany's collapsing industrial base. When the war ended in 1945, both Allied and Soviet forces raced to capture as much of Germany's jet technology as possible. The Americans brought Wernher von Braun and his rocket team home under Operation Paperclip, and they were equally eager to get their hands on German jet engines. The Soviets captured their own share.
The British, who had been first with a working jet engine but slow to exploit it, found themselves watching their technology spread across the world. Whittle's engine design had already crossed the Atlantic. In 1941, the British government shipped a complete Whittle engine to the United States, where General Electric was selected to build it. Whittle himself went to America to help, traveling under the assumed name Whittle. General Electric had their version of the engine, the Type 1, running on a test stand within 6 months, which astonished Whittle. 6 months after that, the Bell Aircraft Company had a twin-engine jet airplane flying. The Americans had resources, enthusiasm, and manufacturing capacity that made Whittle's experience in Britain look almost tragic by comparison. If only he had had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, he later said, what a difference it would have made. So, by 1945, the jet engine existed. It worked. It had flown in combat.
But it was still brutally limited by the wall of temperature. Turbine inlet temperatures were capped at maybe 1500 to 1700 degrees Fahrenheit by the available materials. Engine lifetimes were measured in dozens or hundreds of hours, not thousands. And the engines were thirsty, burning enormous quantities of fuel for the thrust they produced. The decades that followed would see an all-out assault on the wall of temperature, driven by two very different pressures. The military wanted faster and higher-flying jet fighters. The airlines, which were just beginning to see the commercial potential of jet travel, wanted engines that could last long enough to be economical. Both needed hotter-running turbines. Both needed better materials. And the materials, scientists and metallurgists who answered that call would produce some of the most remarkable innovations in the history of engineering.
Innovations so subtle and so precise that they push the boundaries of what you might think is possible to do with metal. The first thing to understand about turbine blades is how extreme their working environment truly is. A turbine blade in a modern jet engine is about the length of your hand. It sits in a stream of gas that is moving at the speed of sound and burning at roughly 2500 degrees Fahrenheit or more. The blade itself is spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, which means the centrifugal force trying to fling it out of the disc is enormous.
equivalent to hanging a 10-ton weight from its tip. And it has to do this for thousands of hours without cracking, warping, melting, or falling apart. At the temperatures involved, conventional steel is useless. It would lose its strength and deform almost immediately. The first major advance was the development of nickel-based superalloys, metals that contained large amounts of nickel along with chromium, cobalt, tungsten, and other elements that helped them maintain their strength at high temperatures. These alloys were a dramatic improvement over ordinary steel, but they still had limits. The next advance was in how the blades were manufactured. Traditional metal parts are made by casting, pouring molten metal into a mold and letting it solidify. When metal solidifies from a melt, it forms crystals, tiny regions where the atoms are arranged in a regular pattern. The boundaries between these crystals, the grain boundaries, are weak points. At high temperatures and high stresses, cracks tend to form along grain boundaries and propagate, eventually causing the blade to fail. In the 1960s, metallurgists developed a technique called directional solidification.
Instead of letting the metal cool and crystallize randomly, they controlled the cooling process so that all the crystals grew in the same direction, aligned along the length of the blade. This meant the grain boundaries all ran lengthwise, parallel to the centrifugal force. Since cracks propagate along grain boundaries, and the force was pulling along the boundaries rather than across them, the blades became much more resistant to the kind of creep failure that had limited earlier designs. It was a clever trick, using the physics of crystal growth to fight the physics of mechanical failure. But the real breakthrough came in the 1970s and 80s with the development of single crystal turbine blades. If grain boundaries are the weak points, the engineers reasoned, then the ultimate solution is to eliminate grain boundaries entirely. Make the entire blade from one single crystal. No boundaries, no weak points, no crack initiation sites. Just one continuous, perfect crystal of superalloy, shaped into a blade. Making a single crystal turbine blade is an extraordinary feat of manufacturing. You start with a mold of the blade shape, fill it with molten superalloy, and then very carefully control the cooling so that solidification starts at one point and spreads outward, growing a single crystal through the entire blade. The process uses a device called a crystal selector, a narrow, twisted passage at the base of the mold that allows only one crystal orientation to pass through. It is like filtering grains of sand through a maze so that only one grain makes it to the other side. The result is a blade that is, in its entirety, one unbroken crystal lattice. A single crystal the size of your hand, shaped like a turbine blade, capable of surviving conditions that would destroy any ordinary metal.
Single crystal blades can operate at temperatures roughly 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit higher than conventionally cast blades of the same alloy. That does not sound like much, but in jet engine design, every degree of turbine inlet temperature translates directly into more power, better efficiency, and lower fuel consumption. 150 degrees is a significant gain, but even single crystal blades are not enough on their own. The gas temperatures in a modern jet engine are genuinely above the melting point of the blade alloy. The blades survive only because they are internally cooled, and the cooling systems inside a modern turbine blade are among the most intricate pieces of engineering in existence. A modern cooled turbine blade is not a solid piece of metal. It is hollow, riddled with a network of tiny passages and channels through which relatively cool air, bled from the compressor, flows continuously.
This air enters the blade through its root, where it is attached to the disc, and flows through the internal channels, absorbing heat from the blade walls. Some of the air exits through tiny holes on the blade surface,
forming a thin film of cooler air that hugs the outside of the blade and insulates it from the searing gas stream. This is called film cooling, and it is that thin film, that boundary layer of cooler air, maybe a few thousandths of an inch thick, that is the difference between a blade that survives and a blade that melts. The internal channels are extraordinarily complex. They include serpentine passages that force the air to make multiple turns inside the blade, maximizing heat absorption. They include pin fins, tiny cylindrical protrusions inside the channels that increase the surface area and turbulence of the cooling air, improving heat transfer. They include pedestals that provide structural support while the cooling air flows around them. And all of this is inside a blade that is about the size of a large pocket knife. These internal features are created during the casting process using ceramic cores, incredibly detailed ceramic shapes that are placed inside the mold before the metal is poured. The metal solidifies around the ceramic cores, and then the cores are chemically dissolved, leaving behind the intricate network of cooling passages. The ceramic cores themselves are works of art, manufactured to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch. If a core is even slightly out of position, the blade wall will be too thin in one spot and too thick in another, and the cooling will not work properly, and the blade will fail. On top of all this, the outer surface of the blade is coated with a thermal barrier coating, a thin ceramic layer, usually based on a material called yttria-stabilized zirconia, that acts as an insulator. This coating reduces the heat flux into the metal by an additional significant amount, allowing the blade to operate in gas temperatures that are even further above its melting point. When you put it all together, single crystal alloy, internal cooling passages, film cooling, thermal barrier coating, you have a turbine blade that can operate in gas temperatures of 2800 to 3000 degrees Fahrenheit, while keeping the metal itself at a temperature it can survive, maybe 1800 to 2000 degrees. The gap between the gas temperature and the metal temperature is bridged entirely by engineering, by air management, by coating technology, by crystal structure. It is one of the most impressive achievements in all of materials science. And the result of all this work, all these decades of incremental improvement, is that modern jet engines can run at turbine inlet temperatures that would have been inconceivable to Whittle or von Ohain.
Their engines ran at maybe 1500 degrees. Modern engines run at 2800 or more. That difference translates into engines that are vastly more powerful, vastly more efficient, and vastly more durable than anything the pioneers could have imagined. Let me take a moment here to talk about something that has not come up yet, but that played a critical role in pushing jet engines beyond the wall of speed in the military domain. That is, the afterburner. The basic turbojet, as we have described it, produces a certain amount of thrust at full power. But what if you need more? What if you are a fighter pilot and you need to climb faster, or accelerate to engage an enemy, or outrun a missile? The gas coming out of the turbine still contains a lot of unburned air. Roughly 3/4 of the air that entered the engine was used for cooling and dilution in the combustion chamber and never actually participated in combustion.
That air is hot, but it still has oxygen in it. What if you burned more fuel in it? That is exactly what an afterburner does. It is, in effect, a second combustion chamber, a very large and simple one, mounted between the turbine and the exhaust nozzle. Fuel spray rings inject fuel into the exhaust stream, A device called a flame holder, an ugly network of angular gutters and baffles, creates turbulence in the flow to mix the fuel and air and keep the flame from being blown out the back. The fuel ignites, temperatures climb back up to 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit or more, and the gas velocity at the exhaust nozzle increases dramatically. The result is a thrust increase of 50% or more, sometimes much more. But it comes at a terrible cost in fuel consumption. With the afterburner lit, fuel consumption doubles or triples. That is why afterburners are used only for short bursts, takeoff, combat maneuvers, climbing through the sound barrier.
No pilot runs an afterburner continuously. The aeroplane would run out of fuel in minutes. Well, almost no pilot. There was one aeroplane that was designed to run its afterburners continuously for an hour or more at a time, and it was one of the most extraordinary flying machines ever built. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the legendary spy plane, cruised at Mach 3.2, more than 3 times the speed of sound, at altitudes above 80,000 feet. Its Pratt & Whitney J58 engines were conventional turbojet engines at low speeds. But at high speeds, something remarkable happened. At Mach 3.2, the air entering the engine was already so compressed by the shock waves forming on the engine's inlet spike, a large adjustable cone that protruded from the front of the engine nacelle, that the compressor and turbine inside the engine were contributing only a fraction of the total thrust.
The majority of the thrust, roughly 58%, came from the pressure recovery of the inlet system itself. The shock waves on the spike and inside the inlet were decelerating the supersonic air and converting its velocity into pressure, and that pressure, released through the exhaust nozzle, provided more thrust than the engine's own combustion. At cruise, the J58 was essentially a ramjet with a turbojet sitting inside it, acting as a pump. The engine could not work at all without the inlet spike precisely positioning the shock waves. If something disturbed the shockwave pattern, a pressure fluctuation, an internal error, the shock waves would be blown out of alignment, and the engine would lose up to 70% of its thrust instantaneously. This was called an inlet unstart, and it was one of the most violent experiences an SR-71 pilot could endure. The airplane would jerk abruptly to one side, slamming the pilot's helmet against the cockpit canopy.
The onboard computer would immediately try to reposition the spike to recapture the shockwave, but the seconds between the unstart and the recovery were genuinely harrowing. The SR-71 operated in an environment so extreme that virtually every aspect of the airplane had to be rethought from scratch. The skin reached over 700 degrees Fahrenheit at cruise speed, which meant it had to be made from titanium rather than aluminum. The fuel, a special formulation called JP7, was designed to resist spontaneous ignition, even when the fuel tanks themselves were at several hundred degrees. To ignite the JP7 in the engine, a shot of a chemical called triethylborane, which ignites on contact with air, was injected first to start the combustion. The famous green flame blast at startup was the triethylborane burning.
The aeroplane leaked fuel while sitting on the ground because the titanium panels were designed to expand at high temperatures, and at room temperature, the gaps between them let fuel seep out. Ground crews had charts for allowable drip rates. The SR-71 would take off, climb to altitude, refuel from a tanker because it could not carry a full fuel load on the ground due to weight limitations on the landing gear, and then accelerate to cruise speed, at which point the panels would expand, the gaps would close, and the leaking would stop. Every part of this machine, from the inlet spikes to the fuel to the tires,
which were infused with aluminum powder to resist heat and inflated to 400 pounds per square inch, was designed for one purpose: to operate at the very edge of what was physically possible. And the engines, those J58s, were the heart of it. They represented the wall of speed, pushed to its absolute extreme, using every trick in the book and inventing a few new ones along the way. The SR-71 was retired in 1999. No airplane has matched its speed or altitude records since. It remains a testament to what jet engine technology can achieve when engineers are given the freedom and the funding to push every boundary at once. But for commercial aviation, speed was not the priority, efficiency was. And the story of how the jet engine transformed from a military technology into the engine of global commerce is really the story of how engineers solved the efficiency problem we talked about earlier, the turbofan revolution, and all the incremental improvements that followed it. Let me fill in a critical chapter of that story that we skipped over.
The transition from piston-powered airliners to jet-powered airliners, which happened in the 1950s and which changed the world more profoundly than most people realize. By the late 1940s, the major airlines were flying long-distance routes with large four-engine propeller-driven airplanes. The Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, the Boeing Stratocruiser. These were elegant, pressurized, relatively comfortable machines, but they were slow. A transatlantic crossing took 12 to 15 hours with a refueling stop in Newfoundland or Iceland. The engines, big radial piston engines producing 2,000 or 3,000 horsepower each, were complex, maintenance-intensive, and noisy. They vibrated, they leaked oil, the cabins smelled of exhaust. The British were the first to put a jet-powered airliner into service. The de Havilland Comet, with 4 turbojet engines buried in the wing roots, entered service with BOAC in May of 1952.
It was a revelation. Smooth, fast, quiet compared to piston airliners, and it cruised above the weather at 35,000 feet. Passengers loved it. The airlines loved it. The future, it seemed, had arrived. Frank Whittle, who had left the Royal Air Force in 1948 and was working as a consultant for BOAC, was closely involved with the Comet's introduction. He was worried about several aspects of the design, including the strength of the fuselage around the square passenger windows. He made suggestions to de Havilland about how to address the issue. His advice was ignored. In 1954, 2 Comets broke apart in mid-air within months of each other, killing everyone on board. The investigation revealed that metal fatigue, originating from stress concentrations at the corners of the square windows, had caused the fuselage to crack open at high altitude. It was a disaster for British aviation.
The Comet was grounded, redesigned with oval windows and a thicker fuselage, and eventually returned to service. But by then, the Americans had taken the lead. The Boeing 707, which entered service in 1958, was the airplane that brought jet travel to the masses. It was powered by Pratt & Whitney JT3C turbojet engines, later replaced by JT3D turbofans, and it could carry 140 passengers across the Atlantic non-stop at 500 miles per hour. The Douglas DC-8 followed shortly after. Together, they made jet travel the standard for long-distance routes, and within a few years, the great propeller airliners were retired. The transition was astonishingly fast. In 1957, more transatlantic passengers traveled by ship than by air. By 1959, more traveled by air. By the mid-1960s, the ocean liners were being retired or converted to cruise ships. The jet engine had not just changed aviation. It had killed the passenger ship industry and reshaped global travel patterns in less than a decade. But those early turbojet-powered airliners were fuel-hungry. The engines were loud. The economics worked for long-haul routes where speed mattered, but for shorter routes, the fuel costs were punishing. The airlines needed something better. And what they got in the 1960s and 70s was the turbofan. We have already talked about the turbofan concept, Whittle's bypass engine idea from 1936. But let me walk through how it actually works in a bit more detail, because the engineering is elegant and the implications are profound. Picture a turbojet engine, the kind we built together earlier. Inlet, compressor, combustion chamber, turbine, exhaust nozzle. Now imagine adding a very large fan at the very front of the engine, upstream of the compressor.
This fan has long blades, much longer than the compressor blades, and it is housed inside a larger outer casing called the fan case. When the fan spins, it does two things simultaneously. The inner portion of the fan blades feeds air into the compressor just like normal, and that air goes through the whole engine cycle: compression, combustion, expansion, exhaust. That is the core airflow, and it works exactly like a turbojet. But the outer portion of the fan blades, the longer parts, grab a much larger volume of air and push it backward through the space between the engine core and the outer fan case. This air does not go through the combustion chamber. It does not get heated. It simply gets pushed backward by the fan and exits through its own nozzle at the rear. This bypass air provides thrust in exactly the same way as the core exhaust, by accelerating air backward. But it is a large mass of air being accelerated a modest amount, as opposed to the core exhaust, which is a smaller mass accelerated a lot. And as we discussed, moving more air more gently is a more efficient way to produce thrust. Spinning that big fan takes a lot of power. So the turbine section of a turbofan has to be bigger, with more stages, than a comparable turbojet turbine. In a modern high-bypass turbofan, the low-pressure turbine that drives the fan might have 5, 6, or even 7 stages. It is extracting a lot of energy from the exhaust gas to power that enormous fan. But the trade-off is worth it, because the fuel savings from the higher propulsive efficiency more than compensate for the additional turbine stages. In a modern large turbofan like the ones on a Boeing 787 or Airbus A350, the fan might be over 100 inches in diameter, more than 8 feet across. The bypass ratio might be 10 or 11 or 12 to 1. The fan alone is producing 80 to 85% of the total thrust. The core engine, the turbojet at the heart of the machine, is producing only 15 to 20%. In a sense, the modern turbofan is not really a jet engine at all. It is a giant, ducted fan, powered by a relatively small jet engine that serves mainly as a gas generator to drive the fan. And the efficiency gains are enormous. A modern high-bypass turbofan might have a specific fuel consumption, the amount of fuel burned per pound of thrust per hour, that is 40 or 50% lower than a pure turbojet producing the same thrust. That translates directly into lower operating costs, longer range, and lower ticket prices. The turbofan is the reason you can fly across the country for a few $100s instead of a few thousand. One more step in this efficiency story deserves mention.
We talked about the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan, where a reduction gearbox sits between a fan and the low-pressure turbine. But the idea of using gearing to allow different parts of the engine to spin at their optimal speeds has a long history. Turboprop engines, which use a gas turbine to drive a conventional propeller through a reduction gearbox, have been doing this since the late 1940s. A turboprop is essentially a jet engine where almost all the exhaust energy is extracted by the turbine and used to spin the propeller. Only about 10% of the thrust comes from the residual exhaust jet.
The other 90% comes from the propeller. And because the propeller is moving a very large mass of air by a very small amount, the propulsive efficiency is excellent, often over 80%. Turboprops are the most fuel-efficient engine type at speeds below about 400 miles per hour.
That is why they are the engine of choice for regional airlines and commuter aircraft. But at higher speeds, the propeller runs into the same wall we talked about at the beginning of this story. The blade tips approach the speed of sound, efficiency drops, and the engine reaches its limit. The turbofan bypasses this problem by enclosing the fan in a duct, which allows it to handle the air more efficiently at higher speeds than an exposed propeller could. The fan blades are shorter and sturdier than propeller blades, and the duct constrains the airflow in a way that reduces losses. So the progression from propeller to turbojet to turbofan is really a progression along the spectrum of that simple equation, T equals M times A. Propellers maximize M and minimize A. Turbojets maximize A and accept a small m. Turbofans find the sweet spot in between, moving a lot of air at a moderate velocity, combining the best features of both. And now, in the 21st century, the turbofan is the unquestioned dominant engine type for commercial aviation. Virtually every large commercial airplane in the world is powered by a high bypass turbofan. The technology has matured to the point where these engines routinely operate for 20,000 hours or more between major overhauls, carrying millions of passengers billions of miles every year, with a reliability record that would have seemed miraculous to the engineers who struggled with the Jumo 004's 25-hour lifespan. That is the distance traveled since 1944. From 25 hours to 20,000. From engines that could not tolerate a quick throttle movement without flaming out, to engines that managed themselves automatically through every phase of flight. From turbine blades made of ordinary steel that warped after a few dozen hours, to single crystal superalloy blades with internal cooling passages and ceramic coatings that operate above their own melting point for thousands of hours. From a concept that everyone said was impossible to a technology that carries over 4 billion passengers a year. Wall after wall after wall, broken. But even as the wall of temperature was being slowly pushed back, degree by painful degree, the jet engine was running into another wall entirely. A wall that had nothing to do with metallurgy or materials science. A wall that was, in some ways, even harder to overcome, because it required rethinking the fundamental architecture of the engine itself. The problem was efficiency, and the man who had first identified it and first proposed the solution was, once again, Frank Whittle.
Because Whittle had seen this wall coming before anyone else, way back in 1936, and he had even filed a patent on the idea that would eventually break through it. But by the time the world was ready to listen, Whittle had been pushed out of his own industry, and the credit would go to others. Here is the problem, and it goes back to our simple equation. Thrust equals mass times acceleration. T equals m times A. A turbojet engine, the kind that Whittle and von Ohain invented, works by taking a relatively small amount of air and accelerating it to a very high velocity. The exhaust comes screaming out the back at maybe 1,000 or 1,500 miles per hour. That gives you good thrust, but there is a catch. Accelerating air to those speeds takes a lot of energy, and a lot of that energy ends up as noise and waste heat in the exhaust, rather than useful thrust.
The propulsive efficiency of a pure turbojet, meaning the fraction of the engine's energy that actually goes into pushing the airplane forward, is only about 50% at typical cruise speeds. The other 50% is wasted. Compare that to a propeller, which moves a huge mass of air and accelerates it by only a small amount.
At moderate speeds, a propeller is 80% efficient or better. The reason is simple physics. It is more efficient to produce a given amount of thrust by accelerating a large mass of air by a small amount than by accelerating a small mass of air by a large amount. The wasted kinetic energy in the exhaust is proportional to the square of the velocity difference between the exhaust and the surrounding air. So halving the exhaust velocity reduces the wasted energy by a factor of 4. This is why turbojets are so fuel-hungry. They produce thrust the wasteful way, by throwing a small amount of air backward very fast.
From military jets, where speed and altitude matter more than fuel economy, that is an acceptable trade-off. But for commercial aviation, where you need to carry passengers thousands of miles at reasonable ticket prices, the fuel consumption of a pure turbojet is a serious problem. Whittle understood this from the earliest days of his work. In 1936, the same year he founded Powerjets, he filed a patent for what he called a bypass engine. The idea was elegant. Instead of sending all the air through the core of the engine, through the compressor and combustion chamber and turbine, you would add a large fan at the front that would push a much bigger volume of air around the outside of the core, bypassing it entirely. This bypass air would not be heated. It would not go through the combustion chamber. It would just be accelerated by the fan and shot out the back. A large mass of air accelerated a modest amount. The core engine, the gas generator, would still do its thing, compressing, burning, expanding. But it would also drive the big fan at the front, and the fan's bypass air would provide a substantial fraction of the total thrust. You would get the high altitude capability and high speed of a jet, because the core was still a jet. But you would also get much of the propulsive efficiency of a propeller, because the fan was doing what a propeller does, just in a different form. This is the turbofan engine, and it is the single most important development in jet propulsion since the turbojet itself. Virtually every commercial jet airplane you have ever flown on is powered by turbofan engines. That big circular opening at the front of the engine, on a Boeing 737 or a 787, the part that looks like a giant fan, that is a giant fan. And it is doing most of the work. The ratio of bypass air to core air is called the bypass ratio, and it is one of the key numbers that defines a turbofan. An engine with a bypass ratio of 6:1 moves 6 times as much air around the outside of the core as through it. A modern, large turbofan, like the ones on a Boeing 777 or an Airbus A350, might have a bypass ratio of 10:1, or even 12:1. That means 90% or more of the air moved by the engine never goes through the combustion chamber at all. It just gets pushed backward by the fan. And here is the payoff. A turbofan with a bypass ratio of 6:1 might have a propulsive efficiency of 75% or better, compared to 50% for a pure turbojet. That means dramatically lower fuel consumption per pound of thrust, which means the airplane can fly farther on the same amount of fuel, which means the airline can charge lower ticket prices, which means more people can afford to fly.
The turbofan engine is the reason that air travel went from a luxury for the wealthy to something that over 1 billion people do every year. Whittle saw this coming in 1936. He called his concept the LR1, which stood for Long Range 1. He envisioned it as the engine for a long-range bomber and later as the engine for a transatlantic airliner. He understood that the turbojet, as he had invented it, was only the beginning. The real future lay in the bypass engine. But Whittle never got to build his turbofan. When Powerjets was nationalized in 1944, the bypass engine project was one of the things that was cancelled.
The men who had pioneered the whole technology were, in Whittle's bitter words, deprived of the right to design and build engines. He and most of his leading team members resigned. The first turbofan would not appear in airline service until the early 1960s, built by Pratt & Whitney in the United States.
By then, Whittle had left the aviation industry entirely, a broken and exhausted man who had suffered a series of nervous breakdowns from the years of overwork, financial stress, and bureaucratic betrayal. The turbofan's arrival in commercial service was a revolution. The Pratt & Whitney JT3D, a turbofan based on the earlier JT3 turbojet, entered service on the Boeing 707 in the early 1960s. It was followed by other turbofans from General Electric and Rolls-Royce. Each generation was more efficient than the last, with higher bypass ratios, higher turbine inlet temperatures, and better materials. The engines got quieter too, a critical advantage as the jet age brought increasingly loud noise to communities near airports. By the 1970s, the high bypass turbofan had arrived. Engines like the Pratt & Whitney JT9D, which powered the original Boeing 747, had bypass ratios of around 5:1. These were enormous engines, with fan diameters of 8 feet or more, producing 40,000 pounds of thrust or better. And their fuel efficiency, compared to the pure turbojets they replaced, was a step change. The 747 could carry 400 passengers across the Atlantic, and it could do it economically enough that airlines could offer affordable tickets. The jumbo jet made mass international travel possible, and the high bypass turbofan made the jumbo jet possible. Each subsequent generation pushed the bypass ratio higher, the turbine temperatures higher, the fan diameter bigger. The General Electric GE90, which powered the Boeing 777 in the 1990s, had a bypass ratio of about 9:1 and produced over 100,000 pounds of thrust, making it one of the most powerful jet engines ever built. Its fan, over 10 feet in diameter, was so large that it was wider than the fuselage of the original Boeing 707.
The Rolls-Royce Trent series, which evolved through multiple versions powering the Airbus A330, A340, A350, and Boeing 787, pushed bypass ratios to 10:1 and beyond, with fan blades made from lightweight composite materials instead of metal, saving hundreds of pounds per engine. And then there is the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan, the PW1000G series, which introduced a reduction gearbox between the fan and the low-pressure turbine. This was a return to a concept that had been used in turboprops for decades, but had never been applied to a large turbofan. The gear allows the fan to spin slowly, while the turbine spins fast, so each can operate at its most efficient speed. The result is even higher bypass ratios, even lower fuel consumption, and significantly reduced noise.
It is a clever piece of engineering, though the gearbox itself, which has to transmit tens of thousands of horsepower while weighing as little as possible, is a formidable engineering challenge in its own right. Every one of these improvements, the higher bypass ratios, the lighter fan blades, the geared drives, the hotter turbine sections, they all trace back to that simple equation. Thrust equals mass times acceleration. The history of the turbofan is the history of making M bigger and A smaller, pushing more air more gently, wasting less energy, burning less fuel. It is the same physics that Newton described, the same insight that Whittle had in 1936. The engineering just keeps getting better. There is a type of jet engine we have not talked about yet, and it deserves its own moment, because it represents the gas turbine's most versatile application. This is the turboshaft engine, sometimes called a free turbine engine, and it is the engine that powers helicopters, natural gas pumping stations, naval vessels,
and a remarkable range of other machines that never go near an airline terminal. The concept is simple and elegant. Take the gas generator section of a jet engine, the compressor, combustion chamber, and gas generator turbine, and mount an additional turbine behind it. This additional turbine, the free turbine or power turbine, is not mechanically connected to the gas generator. It just sits in the exhaust stream, free to spin at whatever speed the hot gas drives it. A shaft from the free turbine connects to whatever you want to power: a helicopter rotor, an electrical generator, a ship's propeller through a gearbox, a natural gas compressor. The beauty of this arrangement is that the gas generator can run at whatever speed is most efficient for it, and the power turbine, connected to the load, can run at whatever speed the load requires. They are aerodynamically coupled, linked by the flow of hot gas, but mechanically independent. One engine design, or a family of designs, can be adapted to an astonishing variety of applications just by changing what is connected to the output shaft. And the power available is impressive. Industrial gas turbines derived from jet engines can produce 40 or 50,000 horsepower in a package that is remarkably compact for the power output. The General Electric LM2500, for example, is an industrial version of the CF6 turbofan engine used on wide-body airliners. It produces about 33,000 horsepower and is used in everything from power stations to naval frigates.
The Rolls-Royce MT30, derived from the Trent Aero engine, powers the electric drive system of the Type 45 destroyer in the Royal Navy. The turboshaft also made modern helicopters possible. Piston-engined helicopters were heavy, vibration-prone, and limited in power. When turboshaft engines became available in the 1950s and 60s, helicopters were transformed. The engines were lighter, smoother, more powerful, and more reliable. They could be mounted on top of the fuselage with a short shaft to the rotor, keeping the center of gravity where it needed to be. The era of the heavy-lift helicopter, the air ambulance, the offshore oil platform support helicopter, all of it traces back to the turboshaft. So the gas generator, that core combination of compressor, burner, and turbine that Whittle conceived in 1928, turned out to be one of the most versatile power sources ever invented. Add an exhaust nozzle, and you have a turbojet.
Add a fan, and you have a turbofan. Add a propeller and a gearbox, and you have a turboprop. Add a free turbine and an output shaft, and you have a turboshaft. Same core idea, same thermodynamic cycle. But an extraordinarily wide range of applications, from fighter jets to container ships, from helicopters to power stations, from pipeline pumps to hovercraft. The gas turbine engine does not just power aviation, it powers a substantial fraction of modern civilization, and none of it was obvious when Whittle filed his first patent. He was thinking about airplanes, he was thinking about speed and altitude and the limits of the propeller. He could not have known that his invention would end up pumping natural gas across Siberia, or generating electricity for cities, or driving warships through the ocean. But that is what happens when you break through a fundamental wall. The consequences radiate outward in directions you cannot predict.
Let me also take a moment to talk about what happens when jet engines fail. Because the engineering that goes into preventing and surviving failures is just as impressive as the engineering that makes the engines work in the first place. The most dramatic type of engine failure is a turbine blade release. If a turbine blade breaks free from its disc at full speed, it becomes a projectile carrying enormous kinetic energy. The blade is already spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, and it weighs perhaps half a pound. The energy involved is comparable to a cannon shot. If that blade breaches the engine casing, it can damage fuel lines, hydraulic lines, flight controls, or even the fuselage. Jet engine casings are designed to contain blade failures. They are reinforced with layers of strong material,
often a ballistic-resistant fabric like Kevlar or a similar aramid fiber wrapped around the most critical sections. The engine is required, by certification rules, to survive a blade-off event without catastrophic damage to the airplane. The engine itself will be destroyed, of course. You are not going to keep running after a turbine blade lets go. But the airplane must be able to continue flying on the remaining engines and land safely. The engine must also be designed so that if one blade fails, the resulting imbalance does not tear the engine off the wing. The engine mounts, the pylons that attach the engine to the airframe, are designed to absorb enormous loads, but also to release the engine cleanly in the most extreme scenarios, so that a wildly imbalanced engine does not transmit destructive vibrations to the wing structure. These are scenarios that engineers spend enormous effort to prevent through design, testing, and inspection. Turbine blades in modern engines are inspected regularly using sophisticated techniques. Borescopes, flexible cameras inserted through small ports in the engine casing, allow inspectors to examine the blades without disassembling the engine. Advanced analysis techniques look for the microscopic cracks that precede failure. Parts are tracked individually, with serial numbers and maintenance histories, so that no blade flies past its safe life. The reliability of modern jet engines is staggering. The rate of in-flight shutdowns for modern high-bypass turbofans is in the range of 1 per every 100,000 engine flight hours. Many individual engines accumulate tens of thousands of hours over many years without a single in-flight shutdown. When you fly on a modern airliner, the probability that an engine will fail during your flight is vanishingly small. And even if it does, the airplane is designed to fly perfectly well on the remaining engines. Twin-engine airliners routinely fly routes that take them hours from the nearest airport, relying on the statistical near certainty that both engines will keep running. This reliability was hard-won. It came from decades of experience, from studying every failure that has ever occurred, from developing better materials and better inspection techniques, from building redundancy into every critical system. It came from engineers who refused to accept that a 1 in 10,000 failure rate was good enough, and pushed for 1 in 100,000, and then 1 in a million. And it is worth remembering as you lie there and think about the engines in the sky above you, that this reliability did not happen by accident. It is the product of millions of hours of testing, thousands of individual improvements, and an institutional culture that treats every failure as a lesson and every near miss as a warning. The engines are not safe because they are simple.
They are safe because they are understood, deeply and completely, by the people who design and build and maintain them. The walls that were broken to get here were not just walls of physics and materials. They were walls of knowledge. And breaking those walls, understanding these machines so completely that you can predict and prevent their failures, is perhaps the most impressive achievement of all. But the turbofan revolution did not just change how much fuel engines burned. It also, almost as a side effect, changed how much noise they made. And that brings us to the next wall. One that is less dramatic than the wall of temperature or the wall of speed, but in some ways just as consequential for the future of aviation. The early turbojets were extraordinarily loud. A pure turbojet produces noise primarily from the high-velocity exhaust jet mixing violently with the still air around it. The faster the exhaust, the louder the noise. And the relationship is steep. Noise power scales roughly with the 1/8 power of the jet velocity. Double the exhaust velocity, and the noise goes up by a factor of 256. That is why military jets with afterburners, where fuel is burned in the exhaust stream to boost velocity even further, are so mind-crushingly loud that you can feel the sound in your chest from miles away.
When jets first entered commercial service in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the noise was a serious problem. Airports that had been tolerable neighbors when they handled propeller aircraft became unbearable when jets arrived. Communities protested. Noise regulations were enacted. Airlines found themselves restricted in when and where they could fly. The turbofan helped enormously, almost by accident. Because the bypass air exits the engine at a much lower velocity than the core exhaust, and because it surrounds the core exhaust, it acts as a buffer. The slow-moving bypass air mixes with the fast-moving core exhaust and reduces the velocity difference between the exhaust and the surrounding air. Lower velocity difference means less violent mixing. Less violent mixing means less noise. A high bypass turbofan is dramatically quieter than a pure turbojet producing the same thrust. Modern engines have taken this further with features like chevrons, those sawtooth-shaped notches you see on the trailing edge of the engine nacelle on a Boeing 787. These chevrons promote smoother mixing between the exhaust and the ambient air, reducing noise further. Acoustic liners inside the engine nacelle absorb sound waves. Fan blade shapes are optimized not just for aerodynamic efficiency, but for noise reduction. The result is that a modern turbofan engine produces something like 75% less noise than the turbojet engines of the 1960s, even though it produces far more thrust.
And yet the wall of noise has not been fully broken. Even with all these improvements, jet engine noise remains a major concern for communities near airports, and it constrains airport operations. Night curfews, noise abatement procedures, approach and departure paths designed to minimize noise over populated areas, all of these exist because jet engines, even quiet ones, are still loud. And as air traffic continues to grow, the pressure to make engines even quieter will only increase. Which brings us at last to the wall that the jet engine industry is facing right now. A wall that is different from all the ones that came before, because it is not primarily a technical challenge. It is an environmental one. Jet engines burn fossil fuel. Kerosene, to be specific, a refined petroleum product in the same family as diesel fuel and heating oil. When kerosene burns, it produces carbon dioxide, water vapor, nitrogen oxides, and other emissions.
And those emissions contribute to climate change. Aviation accounts for roughly 2 to 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions, which does not sound like much until you consider that air travel is growing rapidly and that no other sector of the economy is as difficult to decarbonize. You can electrify a car or a train. You can put solar panels on a factory, but you cannot, with current technology, run a long-haul commercial airplane on batteries. The energy density of batteries, the amount of energy stored per pound of weight, is roughly 50 times lower than the energy density of jet fuel. An electric airplane that could carry 300 passengers across the Atlantic would need batteries so heavy that it could never get off the ground. The physics simply does not work. So the aviation industry is pursuing several paths simultaneously.
One is sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, which is kerosene-like fuel produced from biological feedstocks, waste cooking oil, agricultural residues, or even captured carbon dioxide and water using renewable energy. SAF can be used in existing jet engines with no modifications, which is a huge advantage. But production volumes are tiny, costs are high, and scaling up to replace the hundreds of billions of gallons of conventional jet fuel burned each year is a monumental industrial challenge. Another path is hydrogen. Hydrogen can be burned in a modified jet engine or used in a fuel cell to generate electricity for an electric motor. It produces no carbon dioxide when burned, only water vapor. But hydrogen has its own challenges. It has a very low density, even as a liquid, so you need enormous fuel tanks, roughly 4 times the volume of conventional tanks for the same energy. It has to be stored at -423 degrees Fahrenheit, which requires heavy insulation and cryogenic systems. The airport infrastructure to handle liquid hydrogen does not exist, and producing green hydrogen, hydrogen made using renewable energy rather than natural gas, is currently expensive. A third path, which is further off, is hybrid electric and fully electric propulsion for shorter flights. Battery technology is improving, and for short-haul flights of a few hundred miles, electric or hybrid electric airplanes may become viable within the next couple of decades. Several companies are actively developing such aircraft. But for the long-haul flights that account for the majority of aviation's emissions, electrification remains a distant prospect. The wall of the environment is the wall that today's generation of engineers is working to break through.
It may be the hardest wall of all, because it requires not just new engine technology, but new fuels, new infrastructure, new economics, and new political will. And unlike the previous walls, which affected mainly the engineers and pilots and airlines involved, this wall affects everyone on the planet. Now let me come back to Whittle's personal story for a moment, because what happened to him after the war is important, not just because it is a human tragedy, but because it tells you something about how innovation actually works, and how the people who break through walls are not always the ones who benefit from what they find on the other side. After the war ended in 1945, Britain was, by Whittle's assessment, genuinely ahead of the world in all forms of gas turbine development. The country had the knowledge, the experience, and a head start of several years over everyone else. Whittle was a national hero. He was promoted to Air Commodore, one of the highest ranks in the Royal Air Force. He received a knighthood from King George VI at Buckingham Palace in 1948. He was given a financial award of £100,000 for his invention, which was a significant sum at the time, worth perhaps £3 million in today's money. But it was not enough. The financial award paled in comparison to the commercial value that the engine companies were extracting from his ideas. Rolls-Royce, de Havilland, Bristol, all of them were building jet engines based on knowledge that had flowed from Whittle's work, and all of them were making money from it. Whittle had been patriotic. He had shared everything freely for the war effort, because he was a serving officer and because he believed it was the right thing to do.
But the result was that the companies who had once rejected his invention were now profiting from it, while Powerjets, the company he had founded, had been nationalized and stripped of the right to build engines. The strain of the war years had devastated Whittle's health. He had driven himself relentlessly, working through nights at Brownsover Hall, the country house near Ladywood, where he retreated to work because the factory was too noisy and crowded. He survived on tea and determination, and the conviction that his work could shorten the war. But the combination of technical pressure, financial anxiety, bureaucratic warfare, and the simple physical toll of years without adequate rest caught up with him. He began suffering from what were described at the time as nervous breakdowns. By 1948, Whittle had been declared unfit for flying. For a man who had joined the Royal Air Force because he loved flying more than anything, this was devastating. He retired from the service, and with that retirement, the institution that had been the center of his life since he was 16 years old was gone. He sought a role in the jet engine industry he had created. Nobody hired him. His stature, his fame, his intensity made him difficult to place. No engine company wanted the inventor of the jet engine looking over the shoulders of their own engineers. It was awkward. It was,
by any honest reckoning, unjust. In many ways, Whittle told an interviewer decades later, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time that dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties. There was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up. Frustration after frustration. And it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns, and for years, it was years before I really recovered my health. He consulted for BOAC on the introduction of the Comet, the first jet airliner. He travelled. He wrote his memoirs. He watched, from the sidelines, as the industry he had founded grew into a global colossus. In 1976, feeling more appreciated in America than in Britain, he moved to the United States, where he eventually settled near Washington, D.C. In America, Whittle found something that had eluded him at home: recognition. The Americans had always been enthusiastic about his work. They had built his engine in 6 months, put a jet airplane in the air in a year, and treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence. He was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He was honored by NASA and the National Academy of Engineering. He was given awards and accolades that seemed to come more easily from across the Atlantic than from his own country. And in America, he found an unlikely friend.
Hans von Ohain, who had also moved to the United States after the war to work on jet propulsion for the Air Force, was living not far away. The two men, whose parallel work on opposite sides of the war had given birth to the jet age, became genuinely close. They admired each other's work. They talked about engines and physics and the paths their lives had taken. The rivalry that might have been expected between them never materialized, perhaps because both of them understood, better than anyone else in the world, what the other had been through. Von Ohain was always generous in acknowledging Whittle's priority. Whittle had the idea first, filed the patent first, ran an engine first. Von Ohain's engine flew first, in the HE-178, but that was because he had the backing of one of the largest aircraft companies in Germany, while Whittle was fighting for every penny.
The question of who invented the jet engine is less interesting than the fact that both of them, independently, saw the same future and had the determination to chase it. Britain eventually rediscovered its genius. In the 1980s, honours began to flow more freely. The Order of Merit, one of the most exclusive honours the Crown can bestow, was awarded to Whittle by Queen Elizabeth II. Other recognitions followed. By the end of his life, he was acclaimed as one of the greatest engineers of the 20th century, which he was. But the acclaim came late, and the years of struggle and illness and marginalization could not be undone. Whittle continued to think about engines until the very end. He took a keen interest in Concorde, the supersonic airliner, and advocated publicly and privately for a second-generation supersonic transport. He made recommendations to airframe manufacturers. He published papers on aerodynamic improvements. He remained, in his heart, the young cadet at Cranwell who had imagined a faster, higher, more beautiful kind of flight. Concorde was, in some ways, the embodiment of everything Whittle had envisioned. An airplane that flew at twice the speed of sound, powered by turbojet engines with afterburners, crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. It was magnificent. It was also, in economic terms, a failure. Only 20 were ever built. The engines burned fuel at a prodigious rate, and the supersonic shockwave, the sonic boom, restricted it to overwater routes. It flew from 1976 to 2003, a testament to extraordinary engineering and unsustainable economics. Whittle flew on Concorde many times. He loved it. One of the things I never foresaw, he said, is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. He said this with the quiet wonder of a man who had spent his youth imagining speeds that everyone else said were impossible, and who had lived long enough to experience those speeds as a routine passenger, sipping tea at 60,000 feet, while the curvature of the Earth was visible through the tiny windows. But the airplane he was most proud of was not Concorde. It was the 747, the jumbo jet, the high-bypass, turbofan-powered workhorse that had made cheap international travel possible for ordinary people. His son, Ian Whittle, flew 747s for Cathay Pacific, and Frank occasionally rode in the cockpit. There is a wonderful story about a flight into Hong Kong's old Kai Tak airport, where the approach required a dramatic, low-altitude turn around a hillside checkerboard, directly toward the buildings of Kowloon City, before straightening out at the last moment to land on a runway that jutted into the harbour. Ian had not warned his father about this approach.
Frank was very white-knuckled by the time they landed. It is a small, human detail, but it captures something essential. The man who invented the jet engine, who had been one of the best and most daring pilots in the Royal Air Force, who had dreamed of flight since the age of 4, was a nervous passenger when his son was flying the aeroplane. Because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly how much engineering stood between the passengers and the void. He knew what the turbine blades were enduring. He knew how thin the margins were. He knew, because he had spent his life pushing against those margins, that flight is never casual, no matter how routine it looks. Let me also say a word about the environmental wall in more detail, because the scale of the challenge deserves it. Global aviation currently burns something like 95 billion gallons of jet fuel per year. That is a staggering number.
If you tried to fill an Olympic swimming pool with that much fuel, you would need roughly 145,000 pools. The carbon dioxide produced by burning all that fuel amounts to about 900 million metric tons per year, roughly 2.5% of total human-caused carbon dioxide emissions. Now, the jet engine industry has actually been making enormous progress on efficiency. Modern engines burn about 80% less fuel per passenger mile than the first jet airliners of the 1950s. Each generation of engine is a few percent more efficient than the last, and the improvements are ongoing. Lighter composite fan blades, more efficient compressor and turbine aerodynamics, higher turbine inlet temperatures, better cooling systems, geared fan drives, each one shaving another fraction off the fuel consumption. But air travel is also growing rapidly.
Before the pandemic of 2020, global air traffic had been growing at roughly 4 to 5% per year. That means the number of passenger miles flown roughly doubles every 15 years. And this growth is being driven largely by the developing world, by hundreds of millions of people in Asia and Africa and South America who are reaching income levels that allow them to fly for the first time. This growth is, by any reasonable standard, a good thing. Access to air travel connects families, enables commerce, opens opportunities. But it also means that the efficiency gains from better engines are being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of additional flying. This is why the industry cannot simply engineer its way out of the emissions problem with incremental improvements to existing turbofan engines. The improvements are real and valuable, but they are not fast enough to offset the growth in demand. Something more fundamental is needed.
Sustainable aviation fuel. The kerosene substitute, made from biological or synthetic feedstocks, is the most mature alternative. It can be dropped into existing engines and existing fuel infrastructure with no modifications. Some airlines have already operated commercial flights using blends of up to 50% SAF. But global SAF production is currently tiny, well under 1% of total jet fuel consumption. Scaling it up to meaningful levels requires enormous investment in production facilities, sustainable feedstock supply chains, and usually some form of policy support to bridge the cost gap with conventional kerosene, which is cheap because it has been produced at scale for decades and its environmental costs are not priced in. Hydrogen is the more radical option, and the one that generates the most excitement and the most skepticism in roughly equal measure. A hydrogen-burning jet engine is not fundamentally different from a kerosene-burning one.
You still have a compressor, a combustion chamber, and a turbine. Hydrogen actually has some advantages as a fuel. Its energy content per pound is about 3 times higher than kerosene, which means a hydrogen-powered airplane could be lighter for the same range. And when hydrogen burns, it produces water and no carbon dioxide. But the challenges are formidable. Liquid hydrogen has to be stored at -423 degrees Fahrenheit, which requires heavily insulated, double-walled fuel tanks. And hydrogen's density, even as a liquid, is so low that those tanks would need to be roughly 4 times the volume of conventional kerosene tanks for the same energy content. You cannot fit that kind of tank inside a conventional airplane wing. The tanks would probably have to go in the fuselage, which means either a longer airplane, a wider airplane, or fewer passengers. None of these options is ideal. Then there is the infrastructure. Every airport would need hydrogen liquefaction plants, hydrogen storage facilities, hydrogen refueling equipment, hydrogen safety systems. The entire global aviation fuel supply chain would have to be rebuilt from scratch. This is not impossible, but it is a project measured in decades and trillions of dollars. Several major aerospace companies, including Airbus, are actively studying hydrogen-powered commercial aircraft concepts, with initial entry into service targeted for the mid-2030s. These would likely be smaller, shorter-range aircraft at first, building experience with the technology before scaling up to long-haul designs. It is an ambitious timeline, and whether it will be met is uncertain. Electric and hybrid electric propulsion is the third path, and for short-range flights, it may arrive sooner than hydrogen. Battery energy density is improving, and for flights of a few hundred miles with small numbers of passengers, fully electric aircraft may become viable within the next decade or so. Several companies have prototype electric aircraft in flight testing right now. For larger aircraft and longer ranges, hybrid concepts that combine electric motors with small gas turbines or fuel cells are being explored. But for the long-haul flights that account for the majority of aviation's emissions, no battery technology on the horizon can come close to the energy density of liquid fuel. A battery pack with the same energy as the fuel load of a 747 would weigh roughly 50 times as much. The airplane could not carry it, let alone fly with it. Barring a breakthrough in battery technology that nobody currently foresees, electric propulsion will remain limited to short-range applications for the foreseeable future.
So the wall of the environment is real, and it is high, and it will not be broken by any single technology. It will probably be broken, if it is broken, by a combination of everything. Better engines that burn less fuel, sustainable aviation fuels that replace some or all of the kerosene, hydrogen for shorter routes where the infrastructure can be built more quickly, electric propulsion for the shortest hops, operational improvements that reduce fuel burn through better air traffic management, more efficient flight paths,
and less time circling airports waiting to land. And, perhaps, some willingness from all of us to think about how much we fly and whether some of those trips could be made differently. The engineers working on these problems today are facing a wall that is, in some ways, bigger and more complex than any of the walls that came before. The wall of weight was a physics problem with a physics solution.
The wall of speed was an aerodynamics problem with an engine solution. The wall of temperature was a materials problem with a metallurgy solution. The wall of efficiency was a thermodynamics problem with a design solution. The wall of the environment is all of those things at once, plus an economics problem, plus a politics problem, plus a social problem. It requires not just new technology, but new systems, new infrastructure, new economics, and new habits. But if you have been paying attention to this story, you know how it goes. Every wall looks insurmountable. Every wall eventually falls. The question is not whether it will be broken, but when, and by whom, and what the world will look like on the other side. But if the history of the jet engine teaches us anything, it is that walls get broken. Not easily, not quickly, not without setbacks and failures and heartbreak, but they get broken. The wall of weight was broken by the internal combustion engine.
The wall of speed was broken by the turbojet. The wall of belief was broken by stubborn, brilliant men like Whittle and von Ohain, who refused to accept that something was impossible just because everyone said it was. The wall of temperature was broken, degree by metallurgists and materials scientists who pushed metal to do things that metal should not be able to do. The wall of efficiency was broken by the turbofan, by the elegant insight that pushing more air more gently is better than pushing less air more violently. Each wall seemed insurmountable at the time. Each one fell. So let me bring this all the way back to where we started, to you, lying there, settling in for the night, with the sky above you full of engines. Right now, there are something like 20,000 commercial airplanes in the air at any given moment. Each one is powered by 2 or 4 jet engines.
Each one of those engines is running through the cycle we talked about, compressing, burning, expanding, pushing, thousands of times per second. Inside each engine, turbine blades are spinning in gas temperatures above their own melting point, kept alive by a film of cooling air thinner than a sheet of paper. Billions of individual crystal lattice points in those single crystal blades are holding their positions against forces that would shatter ordinary metal. And every one of those engines traces its lineage back to a small, stubborn RAF officer who could not accept that there was a speed limit on the sky.
A man who grew 3 inches to get into the Air Force, who filed a patent at 22, who was rejected by every industry and government official he approached, who built his first engine in a converted foundry on a shoestring budget, who watched it try to destroy itself 4 times before he got it under control, who gave his knowledge freely for the war effort and got pushed out of his own industry for his trouble, who suffered nervous breakdowns and poor health and saw other men get rich from his ideas, who moved to America because he felt more recognized there, who flew in a 747 cockpit with his son and nearly had a heart attack watching the approach into Hong Kong, not knowing his son was going to make a sharp turn at 1,000 feet. Frank Whittle died in August of 1996 at the age of 89.
His ashes were interred at the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell, the place where, nearly 70 years earlier, a young cadet had looked at the sky and imagined a different kind of engine. A meteor and a vampire, 2 of the first jet fighters his engine had made possible, flew over the ceremony. In the last years of his life, Whittle was asked how he felt about what had happened. His answer was characteristically honest. "Things could have been a lot better," he said. "We could have had a much bigger influence on the war. But when I see what has happened in the way of civil aviation, I can only say it is extremely satisfying. Especially when you see something like Concorde. And one of the things I never foresaw is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours." He paused. "And incidentally, another thing I did not foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain for Cathay Pacific." That quiet pride, buried under years of frustration and illness and betrayal, is maybe the most human thing in this entire story. The man who saw the future of aviation before anyone else, who broke through a wall that everyone said could not be broken, lived long enough to see his son flying the machines his idea had made possible. Not in the experimental aircraft he had fought so hard to build, but in a commercial airliner, routine and safe, carrying passengers across the world at 500 miles per hour, 5 miles above the ocean. The engines on that 747 were turbofans, high bypass, high efficiency, the kind of engine Whittle had patented in 1936 and never got to build. They were running at turbine inlet temperatures that would have been inconceivable when he started. They were using materials that did not exist when he filed his patent. They were producing thrust in a way that was smoother, quieter, and more economical than anything he could have imagined. But the core, the heart of the machine, was the same: a compressor, a combustion chamber, a turbine, and a shaft. Air in the front, fire in the middle, thrust out the back. The idea he had in a classroom in Lincolnshire on a winter day in 1928, when he was 21 years old and nobody in the world would listen. That is the story of the jet engine. A story about walls that could not be broken until someone broke them. A story about temperature and speed and weight and efficiency and belief and stubbornness and loss and quiet, hard-won satisfaction. And the walls are still there. There are always more walls. Right now, somewhere, an engineer is staring at a computer screen, looking at a simulation of a hydrogen combustion chamber, or a composite fan blade, or a new kind of thermal barrier coating, and the problem looks impossible.
The physics will not cooperate. The materials do not exist. The money is not there. The deadline is tomorrow. But if the history of the jet engine teaches you anything, it is this: the walls do not stay. They fall. Not because the physics changes, the physics never changes. They fall because people refuse to stop pushing. And that is a good thought to carry with you as you let your eyes close. Somewhere above you right now, those engines are running. They have been running for decades. They will keep running in the morning. The compressors are spinning, the fuel is burning, the turbines are holding, the thrust is pushing. And 300 people who have never heard of Frank Whittle are sleeping peacefully at 35,000 feet, trusting an invention that was supposed to be impossible with their lives. They are right to trust it. The engineering is good. The walls have been broken, and the people who broke them, the ones who would not take no for an answer, the ones who grew 3 inches and tried again, they did their work well. So let that settle. Let the engines hum. The sky is doing what it has always done, holding everything up, silently, reliably, while you rest. The air is flowing. The blades are turning. The physics is working, just as it has since Whittle first opened a fuel valve in a factory in Rugby and watched his engine try to eat itself and thought, well, at least it runs. It runs. It flies. It carries the world. Let that be enough for tonight. The rest can wait until morning.